In this video, we're going to take a look at laying out the UVs for our character. Now, if you're totally new to the world of UV layout, don't worry. It's a very simple concept, easy to understand, and in Blender it's very easy to do. If you're already familiar with the world of UV layout from another 3D application, for instance, then you're in for a treat, because Blender really does make this process extremely simple. So let's take a look at, one, how we do this, and so that those of you who are new can get an idea for what it is we're doing. Right now we have a three-dimensional model, and we want to create a texture for it. Now a texture is a two-dimensional image that we place on top of this 3D model, so that we could, for instance, paint the body yellow, we could make the boots red, we could make the boxing gloves blue if we wanted to. And if we handle that sort of thing, we need some way to take our 3D model and flatten it out. We can't take a two-dimensional image and apply it directly to a 3D surface. We've got to have a flattened version of our 3D surface that we could load up in, say, Photoshop or another image editor, such as maybe the GIMP, and then paint a texture onto the 2D version. So you got to think of this kind of like taking your model, cutting it up into pieces almost like fabric, and then laying those pieces out flat, painting on them, and then putting them all back together here in Blender. It's a very simple process, and the analogy will make more sense after we get going. So our first order of business is to find likely seams where we can split the model up. And these would be just like seams on a piece of clothing. In fact, if you think about them that way, the whole process becomes a lot easier. What I'm going to do is focus on the body first. And let me switch over to edges. It'll just make our first few selections easier. So let's hit Control-Tab-E. And for starters, we're going to put seams around the arms and legs. So I'll hold down Alt, and we'll click on this edge loop around here. So remember, when you hold down Alt, you get a loop. We'll grab the same loop over here on the opposite side. And then I'm going to grab the loop around the edges, and I'm holding down Alt and Shift to make this multiple selection here. So I have 4 loops selected around the arms, around the base of the legs. I'm going to hit Control-E, and here inside my Edges menu, you see Mark Seam. So go ahead and click on that. Now you'll notice that these edges are now highlighted in red, just to let you know that you have a seam there, that you've split the model up. Now I'm also going to make some seams around the very top of the stalk, so we'll hold down Alt and click on this edge, and hit Control-E, click on Mark Seam, like so. And what this will do is this will just cut this cap off, so that if we wanted to paint some, black or excuse me, or a brown design at the very top, then we could do that. And we'll do the same thing down here at the bottom. So hold down Alt, click here, and then Control-E, Mark Seam. Now I need a seam that runs down the back of our banana so that we can lay this out flat. Right now, the what's left of the banana that we haven't marked is still tube-like. And you gotta, if you have a tube or a cylinder of fabric, generally there's at least one seam around it somewhere that is going to allow you to open it up. I think the only exception is some t-shirts these days, but we're not going to worry about exceptions like that. Now an easy way to do this is to hit Control-Tab-V to switch over to vertices. And I'm going to grab one vertex on the back of this seam at the top, and then I'll rotate around here to the underside of our model, and I'm going to grab one vertex right here on the underside of the seam at the bottom. So they're on the same side. Now that done, I'm going to hit W to grab my Specials menu, and at the very bottom of this menu you'll see Select Vertex Path. Now if you click on that, it selects a path of vertices that connects these two vertices. The problem, however, is it has taken what I guess would be the most unlikely approach. I mean, it goes up the front of our character, and then stops here, and then wraps around the siding and goes up. Now, I imagine this is a shortest path kind of calculation, and not at all what I was looking for. So what I'm going to do is come over here to my toolbox, and my Select Vertex Path command, since it was the last thing I did, has some options. I'm going to switch this from Edge Length to Topological. And now we're flowing right down the back of the character, straight from one point to the other, which is perfect. That's exactly what we want. So let's hit Control-E and click on Mark Seam, and now we have added a seam there. At this point, we are ready to create an initial unwrapping for our character, at least to see what the body looks like. Now, I'll give you a warning before we do anything. The other parts of the body, the legs, the arms, they're going to look pretty bad at this point. It's not going to make much sense what's going on there, but I'll try to... Well, I'll make sure that you understand what's happening. It's just not going to look very useful. So let's see here. I'm going to slide this over to buy us a little more room. And let's divide up this window. So I'm going to put my mouse up here on these little diagonal hash marks in the upper right corner of my 3D view. And I'll slide this off to the left to split my view in half. Now, this panel on the right, I'm going to change up to a UV image editor. This will allow us to see our UVs while we lay them out. So on the left, we'll have the three-dimensional version of our character. On the right, we'll have the two-dimensional version that we could potentially load up in Photoshop and paint on. Now on the left, let me go ahead and hit T, and that's just going to take care of my toolbox and give me a lot of room here. I'm going to hit the A key to select everything. Tap U, and that brings up the UV mapping menu, and I'm just going to click on Unwrap. Now we have a lot of stuff here which looks really crazy, like these great big, almost teardrop pieces here. These are the arms and the legs, because they don't have any seams to help them lay out flat. They just look ridiculous. However, if we take a look here, the body is laid out quite nicely. We can see the front of the body, there's the seam running up the back. And this has been laid out in a way that gives us the least amount of distortion. Now, distortion is one of those things that you're just going to have to deal with. If you take a three-dimensional object and you cut it up and try to lay it out flat, I mean, just try to imagine taking a tennis ball and cutting it in half and trying to lay it out flat. It's going to fight you. It's hard to push it down perfectly flat. You can, however, excuse me, if you add some more cuts to it, or if you stretch certain parts out, thereby distorting your image or adding extra seams. When you're creating UVs, you want a nice balance. You want the least number of seams that you can possibly get away with and the least amount of distortion, knowing that at some point you're going to have some. And fortunately, Blender does a really good job of giving us a highly non-distorted version very quickly and easily. Now, I have some faces here which are just kind of floating around, and I'll have to track those down to figure out where those are coming from. For now, let's go ahead and get the remainder of our body parts nicely laid out. And what I'm going to do before I wrap up this video is we'll just go ahead and break off the arms and the legs, and we'll get those laid out. And then in the next video, we'll take a look at how we're going to do the gloves and then the boots. So back over here, let's hit A to deselect everything. Now, I like to grab edges, seams that are kind of tucked out of the way. So for the arm, first off, let's split off the arm from where the boxing glove is. I'm going to switch over to edges, so Control, Tab, E, hold down the Alt key, and we'll click on this little edge loop around the wrist, like so. And let's go ahead and grab the same edge loop on the opposite side. So hold down Alt and Shift and click right there. And we'll hit Control E and mark that seam. Now, I want to grab this edge that runs kind of down the back of the arm, like so. You can see it, you can follow it all the way down. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to switch over to vertices. We'll grab this vertex here at the corner, which is the start of where I want that seam to be. And we'll just kind of follow it down to the last vertex, like so. Hit W and select vertex path, and that grabs exactly what we want. So Control E, mark seam, nice and easy. And the same thing here. Grab one vertex, hold down Shift, grab the second one, just make sure they're on the same line. Which you don't have to. You can let Blender go ahead and make a cut over to the next edge, but your surface will not lay out as nicely if you do that. Let's hit Control E, mark seam. Oh, I'm sorry, my bad. Hit W, select vertex path, then Control E, mark seam. Now, if we hit A to select everybody, and we hit U and click on Unwrap, then everything is still laying out nicely, but the things that are working are very, very small, and that's just because our legs have not yet been properly laid out. Do not yet worry about the changes in size. That doesn't matter to us at all. What we're worried about is just seeing that things look good even when you zoom in on them. So the body looks great. If we come over to the arms, those now look like nicely laid out sleeves of a shirt. You can even see how they taper at the wrist. But that's exactly what we want to see. So that's all well and good. Now, let's do the same thing for the legs. Again, just as a reminder, do not worry about the fact that all of these are now very tiny. That's something we can deal with later. Let's split the legs off from the boots. So I'm going to hit Control-Tab-E to switch over to edges. Hold down Alt, and we'll click on this edge that goes right around where the leg meets the boot. It's a likely place to put a seam because it's really two surfaces. We have the leg here, and then we have the boot touching each other. So hold on Alt and Shift, and we'll grab this edge as well. Control-E and mark seam. Now, we need to I want to grab this edge that runs right along the inside of the leg. It's kind of tucked out of the way. It's not going to be the kind of thing the audience is going to necessarily be staring at. So let's hit Control-Tab-V for vertices. We'll grab the vertex at the top, hold down Shift, grab the vertex at the bottom, hit W, select vertex path, Control-E, mark seam. Same thing on the opposite side. Grab, hold down Shift, W, Control-E, mark. All right, so now if we hit A a couple of times to select everybody, hit U, and we unwrap again, once again, we're running into an area where certain things are just getting ridiculously huge, but don't worry about that yet. Still is nothing to worry about. If we zoom in, however, we still have some areas that are working just fine. We just can't see them very well. So one thing we can do is select all these. So if I hit B, I could just draw a selection box around these just to bring them up to size temporarily. And I'm just scaling them up. So I've got a continuous grab on, so I can just keep on dragging. And for now, this will be just fine. Now let's hit G, and we'll move these out of the way. And now we can really zoom in and take a look. So we have the panels for our legs. We have here we have the front and the back, or the top and bottom of our banana, like so. And then we have our arms as well. And then there's our body. We don't have to worry about their orientation, the fact they're turned around. We don't even have to worry about the fact that they're so tiny. Once we get the boots separated appropriately, once we get the gloves separated appropriately, then after we've done that, the next time we unwrap, everything will be sized accordingly. This discrepancy we're getting in the size is because Blender is having a hard time correctly laying out things like the gloves and the boots because they don't have the seams. And so it's really, really stretching some faces out, trying to flatten it out, and in response, it's scaling these things down. Don't worry about that right now. However, I think this is a good place to pause and take a quick break, and when we get back, we'll take a look at laying out our gloves, and then we'll look at our boots. So that'll wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot. Okay, so we're back, and we're still laying out the UVs for our character. Now, up to now, you've seen me do this on both sides of the character. I'll put a seam on one side, then I'll put a seam on the other. And you don't really have to work that way. I don't really mind showing it to you the first couple of times around because you're just trying to get used to the tools. But one thing you can do, which can be really handy, is go ahead and just cut the character in half one more time, or you don't even have to have applied your mirror and made him a whole character at this point if you don't want to, though it does help if you wanted to make anything asymmetrical prior to laying out your UVs. What I'm going to do is jump over to a front view. Technically it's a back view, but we are looking at the front of the character, and that's with Control 1 on the numpad. I'm going to hit Z to go into wireframe view, hit A to deselect everything. Then let's switch over to faces. So Control Tab, F, and then hit the B key, and I'm going to grab a marquee selection box on the left side of the character. Now that's our left. Technically it's his right. And I'll hit X and delete out those faces and nuke him. Now the reason I'm doing this is that I can go ahead and lay out the UVs on this one side for the glove, which will require some tweaking and some adjustments, and then when I mirror over, those tweaks and adjustments will just come right along for the ride. It will cause some interesting things to happen with the body, but all very easily managed. You'll see that when we get to it. For now, let's hit Z to get out of wireframe view. Let's hit Control Tab E to go into edge mode. Now, laying out the glove or even a hand, for just as another example, is an interesting thing because you just need to think about how you want to paint your texture. Now, and a common way to do it is to lay out the top and the bottom of the hand. If you could picture a seam that ran around the edge of your hand, say right down the middle of your thumb, and then right down the side of your index finger, and then in between your index and your middle finger, and up the side of your middle finger, just kind of basically, if you were to lay your hand on a piece of paper and trace around it, kind of an edge that followed that around the side of your arm. And you could thereby split your hand up into the top of your hand and the bottom of your hand. You could certainly do that. That's similar to what we're going to do, but we're going to keep areas that we know we want to do a lot of work on as together as we possibly can. So here's how I'm going to do this. First off, let's split our boxing glove cuff. So I'm going to make a seam down here along the bottom. And I'm only going to take this to right about where the wrist is. Once I get to the wrist, I'm going to branch off. And I'm going to run this down the side of the hand. Matter of fact, I don't even want to go that far. Let me hit Shift and deselect those. No, I will. Sorry. Second guessing myself, but it happens. We're going to run right down the side of the hand, like so. And we'll curl around. But instead of going right across the tip of the fingers, I'm actually going to curl up this way. And you'll see why here in just a moment. For now, just kind of go with me. Now here, we're going to do something a little different. Instead of following this up, you'll notice how this edge wraps around and goes kind of up over the top of the hand. We're going to turn in one edge early, and this is going to take us right along the thumb, basically splitting right down the center of the thumb. And we get all the way back to this edge where we started. Now take a look at the seam. So I've basically created two panels here. If we were to go ahead and cut this up, we have one panel which is the entire top of the hand, the top of the boxing glove, including the top of the thumb, and then another smaller panel underneath, which is just the palm area and the underside of the thumb. So now let's take this and hit Control E and mark seam. Now up to this point, I've been selecting everybody and hitting U to lay out. You don't really have to do that either if you don't want to. We could, just as a for instance, switch over to wireframe view, hit A to deselect everybody, and then I could draw a box, say around here, right up to the point of the wrist. We could hold down Control and hit the plus key a few times until we get all of the glove, and then when I hit U, all I'm laying out is just the glove surface, as you see here. So we have our one outer piece of the boxing glove and then our inner piece as well. But the pieces don't look all that nicely arranged, unfortunately. We've got a little bit of a problem in a couple of areas, actually. Take a close look. Now, I'm seeing an interesting issue with the geometry here. Do you see this? I'm trying to make sure that I'm not crazy when I see this. Let me get out of wireframe view. Nope, I'm not crazy. Take a look. We have this internal face that's sitting inside my geometry. Let's see if I can put my camera inside and have a look at it and show it off to you. Right here on the left side of the camera. I really need to get rid of that. That's certainly not a good thing to have, and didn't know it was there before. So I'm going to hit Control-Tab F, and we'll select that guy. Let me hit X and delete out that face. And that should solve that problem. The only thing I want to double check now that I've done that is the vertices here and make sure that we don't have any split vertices. So I'm just going to click on each one and move them, and everything seems to be okay. Now how that got created, I really don't know. It was probably some modeling operation. It's also one of those things where it's just a good idea to double check your model in wireframe and see if you have any of those lying around. But that's okay. We nuked it, and it shouldn't cause any more problems for us. So that splits up the boxing glove pretty well. Now I want to take a look at splitting up our boot. And this would be pretty easy overall. We've got this nice seam here on the inside of the leg. We could certainly use that. It is also kind of nicely on the inside of the foot. So let's go ahead and do that. What I'm going to do is grab a vertex here and a vertex here. I'm not going all the way down to the bottom of the foot. I'm actually going to break off the sole of the boot. Now let's hit W and grab Select Vertex Path, Control E and mark seam. Then let's switch over to edges. Control Tab E. Hold down Alt, and we'll select this edge down here on the very bottom. Control E, and mark that seam. And now we've got a nice split down the boot, so that can be opened up. Now, if we were to lay this out, so I'm going to do it the quick and easy, kind of lazy way, and just grab everybody and hit U and unwrap. You'll notice now we're not getting anywhere near as many little odd tiny pieces, which is good. But if we take a look at the bottom of the boot, this is actually not half bad. The only problem I have is that if I wanted to do, little raised vertical lines that go around the edge of the boot, if that was something I wanted to include in the texture, I would need to draw those so that they kind of radiated out from the center of the boot, which is not that big of a deal. But if you didn't want to work that way, if you just wanted to draw all perfectly straight lines, you could break this off as a separate piece of geometry. So what I'm going to do, or a separate UV panel. So if I split this, so grab these two edges here, I'll show you what I mean. Let's hit Control E and mark this as a seam. Hold down Alt and click here, and this just grabs the very bottom of the sole of the boot. And hit Control E and mark this as a seam. Then if we grab everybody and unwrap one more time, now the bottom of the boot is just the footprint, and we have this large stripe area, which we could straighten out if we wanted to. It's actually by grabbing the points. And I'll talk a little bit about editing the points here momentarily. So with that, we've got all of the pieces of our model nicely laid out. Let's go ahead and take a look at maybe doing some editing. So I can come in here and grab vertices like so. I can hit G and I can put these wherever I want. So if I want to start kind of straightening these things out, like these are already in pretty much a nice straight line. So one thing I can do is hit B, just like I do in the regular view, and drag out a selection. Hit R and rotate these. Hit G to move them. So again, it's a lot of the same controls you're already used to seeing. And we could just make use of the grid. As a matter of fact, I could grid snap. I'm going to try to avoid doing that, however, just so that I don't inadvertently resize things that I don't need to. All I'm doing here is just dragging on these points. You just have to remember, if you drag to move them around, you need to click one more time to commit that motion, or at least by default anyway. Now these are relatively straight. I don't really need to make them razor sharp in a perfectly straight line straight, not for this particular texture job. Now there are certain things like mechanical components especially, where if you want to have perfectly aligned textures throughout, it's a good idea to really take the time to snap these to the grid and straighten them out, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Let's hit B and drag out a box like so. Now, I already had somebody selected. Let me hit A to deselect everything first. Then we'll hit B and grab a few things. I'll just keep hitting B. I didn't want to accidentally grab any vertices down here. And I think up through there will work. Let's rotate these. Hit G and move them over. Rotate again. It's pretty close. So hit A to deselect. And again, just kind of straighten these out a little bit. Let's hit, actually cancel that. Let me hit A, grab, oh, didn't mean to do that. Right click. Hit B to grab a box. Let's grab all these guys and I'll rotate them to straighten them out a little bit. Hit G to move them. Hit A to deselect. Hit B to grab just this row here in the middle. Hit G and just pull those down. So it's not a perfectly straight line, but it's really close. It'd be a lot easier for me to draw a bunch of little vertical lines there and get some stripes around the bottom of the boot, which is all I'm really going for. Okay, so with that, we have one side of our model nicely laid out. One thing that is bugging me is if you take a look at the upper portion of our boxing glove, which would be here, I'm going to grab one of the little vertices, one of the UV verts for this, and we'll go to Select, and I'm going to grab Select Linked. That's Control L if you want the hotkey. And I'm going to move this out into space all by itself so I can work on it without distraction from anywhere else. As a matter of fact, I'm also going to give myself a little bit more room on my interface here. We know, just from looking at our mesh, that the boxing glove here is pretty big and bulbous at the end. But if you'll notice here, it's been kind of shrunk down. This is just because of the way the layout calculation handled this. It's not a problem, but I would like to edit this to spread it out a little more, so we see a little bit more of what we'd be expecting to see, which is a great big piece of boxing glove here. This is also going to be very helpful since we've split the model in half. We don't have to do this work twice. So let's start making some edits here. What I'm going to do is grab this one vertex, and then let's turn on proportional editing here inside my UV editor. And I'm going to switch that over to connected. And when I hit G, you'll notice we're kind of moving the whole thing, and that's no good. So what I'm going to do is roll down on the mouse wheel. Actually, hang on, am I rolling in the right direction? I don't think I am. I need to be rolling up on the mouse wheel. And that allows me to bring that circle of influence down. I can resize that with the mouse wheel while I'm moving. And by using proportional editing, this whole process becomes a lot easier. So I can select, hit G, grab, like so. It's very quick and easy. Grab here maybe, pull that out here, and we'll go ahead and tighten that up a little bit. And actually, I'm going to pull this down and just start kind of focusing on cleaning up this area. As a matter of fact, for now, let's turn off proportional editing. I'm going to do that by hitting the O key a couple of times. And then I can just start straightening out edges, because proportional editing is good for helping us get that overall shape. But at some point, you just want to tweak some of the vertices on your own. And just kind of pull these out. Kind of round out the end of the boxing glove here. Okay, and I think overall that's a pretty good place to call it on that shape. Now, if we were to create another layout, if we just selected everybody and hit U, we would lose that edit by default, so just be aware of that. We're not going to stress that right now. For the time being, I'm just going to go ahead and leave things as they are. I think this is a good place to call it for now, so that will wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot. Okay, we are back, and let's wrap up the UV unwrapping for our character. Now, to make this a little bit easier to follow, I'm going to bring in a checker texture. You can download these off the internet all day long. They have all kinds of different styles. Some are multicolored, some have letters and numbers to help you see which way is up or down on your texture. In our case, because our layout is pretty easy to read, it's pretty easy to tell what's an arm, what's a leg, what's a shoe, and so forth. I'm going to just bring in a very simple one that I made in Photoshop, and it's just a black and white checker texture. It's 512 by 512 with 64-bit squares. Now, let's double-check our materials. You need to make sure you have a material applied to your object. If you don't, hit the plus button. Make sure that has a texture. If it doesn't, of course, add one. And we're going to set the type over to image or movie. We'll click Open. And I have a basic checker texture, like so. Now, we want this to show on our character, so I'm going to do a couple of things here. Inside of my UV and image editor, let's go to Image, Open Image, and we'll grab the basic checker, like so. And then, if we come over to our 3D view, we can hit N. We can open up the display area and switch on Textured Solid, and there you are. So now we can see the result. Now what we're looking for, really, is just to make sure that the squares are about the same size across the surface. Now we have some distortion here on the gloves. It's not ideal, but generally I think we can get away with it. It is, at the very least, easy to read as a boxing glove here inside the UV editor, and that can be important as well, as opposed to dealing with distortion. But overall, I think generally I'm okay with what we're looking at here. It will look a little bit funny at the seams, and that's just kind of how UVs tend to work, especially when they're laid out automatically like this. For organics, that's okay. We're going to be creating our own texture. We'll be painting on these UVs anyhow. So for the most part, we should be just fine. Actually, for the simplicity of the texture we'll be using, we'll be perfectly all right. Okay, so there's a couple of things here. Of course, we only have half of the character, and I'm going to at the very least, want to have both halves of the character here where the body is located in our UV section. So let's take a look at how we can do that. First off, since we've kind of verified that these are all okay, now if you see some squares that are turned sideways or diagonal, don't worry about that right now. That's okay, not a problem. I'm going to go ahead and hit X though and remove that texture from our UV editing window. And let's get this guy mirrored back over. Now, I've done a lot of mirroring and unmirroring. It's just the way that I often find myself working. It's just kind of an old habit. So if you find yourself going like, hey, you could have done X, Y, or Z, just understand that's just one of the ways that I work. So let's reapply our mirror modifier. I'm going to jump over to the modifiers tab here in my properties window, go to add modifier, click on mirror, and we can go ahead and just click apply. Now the cool thing about doing that is if I go back into edit mode by hitting tab, it looks like my UVs are exactly where they were a moment ago. They kind of are, but now the left and right legs are stacked, the arms are stacked, the boxing gloves are stacked. We actually have 2 boxing gloves here. And just to kind of illustrate that, if I zoom in and grab a single vertex and hit G and try to move it, you can see there's another one directly underneath it. So that's the left and right halves. It's very convenient if you're going to be making a symmetrical character to create UVs in this way. Now, let's do a couple of things here. I don't want the left and right halves of the body to be this way. I want one whole body with a left and right side that I can paint on. So I need to perform a little bit of a trick here. I'm going to grab, let's hit B, and grab any one of the vertices in here. I want to make sure I don't have anything selected over here. So I'm going to hit Shift and deselect. That's not going to work. So let's hit A to deselect all. Then I'll hit B and grab this guy over here. Now, inside my texture editing window, let's go to Select, and we're going to select Linked, and that's going to grab everybody that was underneath. Now, technically what I have are 2 halves of my banana body. And as a matter of fact, if I hit G, just to kind of pull this out here in space so I can work on it away from everybody else, watch what happens if I deselect with A, grab one of these vertices, and do the same thing. Select Linked, and then hit G to move. Oh, well, it's going to grab them both. That's convenient, but still not exactly what I want to have happen here, because, as you can see, this is just the left half of the character, and it's left and right stacked on top of one another. If I hit G, you can again see the results of that because they're sitting on top of each other. But Blender is still considering those linked. I just need to flatten them out. So to do this, I'm going to grab everybody else. So let's hit A to deselect all. I'm going to hit B and grab all these other pieces. And basically, I want to tell Blender not to do anything with these. Leave them alone for now, because I'm about to do an unwrapping, kind of a flattening operation, but I don't want these pieces messed with at all. So I'm going to go under UVs and pin. You can also do that with the P key. And now these pieces will be completely left alone. I'll hit A to deselect, and then as a shortcut, I can either go to UVs, unwrap, or I can just hit the E key. So let's just hit E, and look what happens to our body. Let me just grab one of these vertices, and we'll go to Select, Select Linked, and I'll hit G and pull this out here so you can see it. Nice and symmetrical. You can see the left and the right sides individually, which is great. But all these other pieces got left alone, which is also good. Let's hit A to deselect, and I'm going to hit B and select all these guys. Now, I can still move them. If I actively select them and hit G, I can move them around, which is really handy, but for things like unwrapping, they don't get disturbed, which I like that. Now, I'm going to lay these out inside my square here. The idea is that we need to keep all of our UVs inside this square. And what I like to do is grab all my pieces and clear them completely out of this square, and then I'll put them in by hand. So I'm going to hit A to deselect all. Let's start with the body, and undo that, so right-click. So with one of these vertices selected, let's go to Select, Select Linked. I'll hit G and drag this over, and I just want to fit it right inside the square. If any of the vertices are hanging over the edge, they will not get textured. So you want to make sure that they're fitting just inside. And that's pretty close there. Let's zoom out, zoom in up here, and that's really close. We could just grab this one vertex and pull it down slightly. Now, when you're creating a layout for your UVs, which is what I'm doing now, there is no right or wrong way to do it. There's just whatever works best for you, whatever makes the most sense. You want to use as much of the texture space as you can. Any open areas that are outside of these UV panels is just wasted pixels. It's parts of the texture that will not be read but still have to be loaded into memory. So you want to keep those to a minimum whenever possible. Now, because this is a simple character and a really basic project, I'm not going to stress that too much, but I do want to make sure you at least hear that, so it's something that you can be practicing. Now I'm going to drag our boxing glove in first, so let's just hit G. Now understand, this is two boxing gloves. It's the left and the right stacked on top of one another. So let's see, if I hit R, I can rotate this around, and ooh, look at that, we had another vertex selected. So I'm going to hit undo, hit A to deselect, hit B, and then grab this guy just by himself. Hit G here, and we'll rotate this, and then hit G, and see if we can just fit it in like so, maybe a little more rotation. As a precaution, you want to leave just a little bit of space in between two panels. In fact, this is probably a lot more than you need, but understand that when you really get down to it, if you have a low resolution texture, 1 pixel might end up being the size of this grid space. The reason that's important to you is you see how that pixel kind of hangs off the side of your geometry. It could actually bleed over to another piece, so it's good to have a little bit of pillow room so that there's not as much texture bleeding from one panel to the next. Alright, now let's start with the arms. So I'll hit A to deselect, let's hit B, grab any selection of vertices here, we'll go to select and grab linked. And I'll just bring these over, and it fits in pretty well just like that. I mean, I do like the idea of being able to straighten out the arm a little bit. So if we did something like this, then the arm is more or less straight out. As a matter of fact, probably should be more like so, because that's the bulge on the bottom of the forearm there. So I think that'll work, and it's pretty easy to read. Next we can take a look at the legs. So let's hit A to deselect, hit B, grab any selection of verts, and then select pinned again. Now that's Shift P. I just find myself wanting to grab it from the menu for some reason. Not pinned, I'm sorry, Control L. But that's on the other side of my keyboard. So G, pull this over, and I'm going to rotate it so it's straight up and down, or at least close to being straight up and down. It doesn't have to be perfect. And we'll position that like so, just kind of fitting it in as tight as we can. Now, we've got our boot area, and I'm going to start with this stripe, this little strip of rubber that we have around the underside of the boot. So let's hit A to deselect, hit B and grab this guy, and we'll hit G to grab that, and I want to see if I can just fit it in right down here, and I'm getting really close. It looks like it'll just barely fit. And up a little bit, and there we go. And I keep finding myself hitting the space bar. I must be having some sort of flashbacks from another UV layout program that I like. So let's hit A to deselect, hit B. We'll grab this piece of the boot here, and I'm just going to bring this down like so. And let's hit A to deselect. Fitting in pretty well so far, but we're probably going to have to make some adjustments to get everything to fit in nicely, it looks like. And it's just one of those things where it's almost like trying to assemble a puzzle. Let's see. I want the sole of the boot in there. The underside of the boxing glove I'm not too stressed out about. If we end up having to shrink that down because it's not getting a whole lot of attention anyway, that won't really hurt my feelings. We do have these tips for the banana, as you can see here, that are still folded over each other because they were on the center line of the body. I'd like to go ahead and unfold those. So let's hit A to select everyone. Let's go under UVs and we'll pin everybody. Then I'm going to hit A to deselect all. Let's hit B and I'll grab at least some of the vertices on both of these pieces. Go to select and select linked. Go to UVs and unpin those. And then we'll just hit E, and that brings those out here. Now, because that's all that was going to get unfolded, it made those huge. It made them a whole lot bigger than we need them to be. So I'm going to pull them out here where they're kind of out away from everything. And it's a little interesting. It's going to be a little tricky at first to tell which one's the top and which one's the bottom. But this one up here with the really thin line at the top, that's got to be the upper area. So what I'm going to do is grab that by itself. Let's hit A, grab just one of these vertices, and we'll go to Select, Linked. I'm going to move this over here and then hit S and scale that down. It really doesn't need a whole lot of texture space anyway. But we can fit it in there a little more nicely with some rotation, like so. Alright, and then same thing here. Let's grab one of these, select, and then select linked. Move it over here into the corner, rotate it, scale it down, and just kind of fit it right there into the corner. Okay. Nice so far. Now, we need to fit in this other piece of the boxing glove as well as the sole of the boot. So let's hit A, make sure everybody's deselected, and let me grab everyone and go to UVs and unpin just to get those red vertices out of our way. They're a little distracting. And let's start here with the arm. So let's see, Control L to grab everybody, and then hit G. Oops, got to be careful of that. So let's make sure we do a box select. So I'll hit B, drag out a box, and then hit Control L. So that'll get both stacks. Then we'll hit G and kind of tighten this up just a little bit. I'm going to allow myself a little bit of error here just for the sake of layout. And let's hit B, and I'm going to grab these vertices here and just drag those in a little ways. And then we'll hit Control L again, hit G, and snug those up a little. Just buys us some more space. And let's hit A, B, grab these guys, Control L, hit G, pull this up. Now we can grab our little shoe here, so let's hit B, drag out any of the vertices here, Control L, G, and that should fit right in there, maybe with a little bit of rotation. That fits in pretty nice. Now that only leaves the underside of the boxing glove. So what I'm going to do is grab my boxing glove itself. So let's hit A, hit B, grab this guy, hit Control L, and I'm actually going to scale this down slightly just to buy myself the tiniest little addition of room. And let's see if I can rotate that. Maybe if we spin it this way, I can snug it right in there. That's not a lot of room between those two panels, but I think it's just enough to get the job done. We can push this right up here to the edge of our texture space. And then let's hit A to deselect, hit B, grab this guy, and slide him in here, and we can scale him down slightly as well. And let's see if he can find some rotation that'll allow him to kind of fit in there. That's close. So there's the thumb. That's what my mouse is sitting next to right now. I can probably make this happen, make this work. Let's see if I can nudge some other pieces around and buy myself some more room. So let's hit B, grab here, Control L, hit G, and we'll snug this in, put a little bit of rotation on it, maybe not that much, and that just brings that down a little. A, hit B, grab these guys, Control L, hit G, and we'll pull that down a little more. Actually, let's rotate it a bit more first. We could maybe spin it around this way and actually buy a little more room out of that. Yeah, they fit together a little more nicely that way. Okay, hit A, B, grab, Control L, G, pull that down, which brings us up to the arm. So A, B, grab, Control L, G, pull that down, and then finally that just gives us this guy. And there we go. In fact, that allows me just a little bit of space to pull that boxing glove off the top of the image just a little bit, give myself a little more room. So A, B, grab, Control L, G, snug that down just a little bit, and we're good. We now have a UV layout, and it's pretty easy to read. We can see that we've got the top of the banana, the bottom of the banana, the body's pretty easy to read. It's a great big boxing glove, it's pretty easy to see. There's the thumb of the underside of the boxing glove. We have an arm sticking out to the side, we have a leg. There's our boot unwrapped with the heel wrapping around the side. There's the sole of the boot, and then we have that stripe which runs around the bottom. In fact, the only piece that's a little hard to read is that stripe that runs around the bottom of the boot. But that is going to wrap things up for this video, so now you can see how that actually works. The last thing we can do is open our basic checker texture back up in here, and I did that just by clicking on my little texture window and selecting it, which made that reappear over here in our 3D view. And you can see how that is being applied to the surface. Again, things look a little weird around some of the seams, but that's okay for now. So that will wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot for watching. Greetings and welcome back. In this video, we're going to start the actual texturing process for our Banana Man character. Now, up to this point, all we've done is just kind of drop this checker texture on him, but we have laid out his UVs. So if I select him and I hit Tab, we can see those over here inside the UV view. So let me go ahead and close out the texture that we've got here, and that'll just allow us to see the UVs by themselves. Now, we need to get these over into Photoshop so that we can paint on them, and that's actually pretty easy to do. We're just going to go down to the UVs menu and go to Export UV Layout. Now, we can give this any name we like. I'm going to call this Banana Man UVs. And you have a few things you need to check. Down here you have your format. Now, I would recommend you leave this on PNG because it does allow for some nice transparency. That transparency is controlled by the fill opacity slider down here. Now, a setting of 0.25 means that the actual faces in between the UVs will be 25% opaque. So they'll be primarily transparent, which is very, very handy if you're going to start using layers in Photoshop to see through to your work, or whatever your layer-based image editing software happens to be. You don't necessarily have to use Photoshop. You could just as easily use the GIMP or any number of other image editing softwares out there. Now, I'm going to set my resolution to 1024 by 1024. We could probably get away with 512 if we wanted to. I just kind of like working at 1024 at least to start with, and then later on, if I just decide that I want to eat up less room, 1024 will downscale to 512 pretty well, as long as you haven't done anything that's too terribly minuscule. So with all that stuff set up, let's go ahead and click Export UV Layout. It'll take just a second, and then everything is exported and ready to rock. So now, let's just go ahead and jump over to Photoshop. So go to File, Open, and here we have our Banana Man UVs. I'll double-click on those, and here we are. So we've got our UV layout in place and ready to go. So now it's just time to give this a shot, and let's just do a quick test and make sure that everything is lining up the way that we want it to. Now I'm going to put my adjustments away, and we'll go and expand out our layers. I'm going to create just a blank layer. And we're going to make just a kind of a random painting here. Now, pardon me for just a second. I'm going to move my little digital tablet around so I can paint on it without too much hassle. And that looks pretty good. Kind of adjust my watch a little bit so it's not scuffing anything. Now, let's see. Let's just go ahead and paint something. I guess it would help if we had some color. So let's grab a bright orange just so that we know what's going on. And I'm just going to scribble. Right now, it doesn't really matter what we're doing. We're just kind of testing out our layout, make sure everything is doing what we want it to do. So I'm just putting kind of an orange dot in here just to kind of prove a point. Now, I'm going to hide out my actual UV layout, and we're going to create just a solid color layer, which I will make black for the time being. All of this is going to change. This is all just kind of a test. So let's hit Control, Alt, Shift, S. That's for save for web. And a PNG24 will be just fine. So we'll go ahead and hit save there. And we'll call this BananaMan _ diffuse and hit save. Now with that done, we'll jump back over to Blender and we'll go over to our textures. Now we've already got a texture that has been applied to our material, and it's not showing up here in our view, but that should be okay. What we're going to do though is replace that with the texture that we've been working on, so we no longer really need the basic texture. So we'll click on our little button here, and we have BananaMan diffuse. Bring that in like so, and we'll go ahead and load that up here inside our image editor. And there we go. So we can see that everything is nice and black, and that we have these nice orange stripes that are running everywhere that we scribbled. So that's good. That tells us that everything that we're trying to kind of accomplish here with just getting our texture set up is working out just fine. So now we can begin the process of creating our texture. Now I do want to give kind of a general disclaimer in that my job here is not necessarily to teach you how to be the most brilliant texture artist in the world. I just want to get across a few basic techniques for getting some texture applied to a very simple character like our BananaMan here. So let's do a few things. First off, layer 1, where we did all the scribbling, we're going to nuke it. Goodbye. I don't mind having a black background. That's fine, but generally I do kind of like working on something like a neutral gray. That way if I paint anything dark, it's just a little bit easier to see. The cool thing about using a color fill for this, though, is that if you need the background to be any other color of the rainbow, it's of course very easy to change. And I use a lot of color fills in my Photoshop workflow. Everywhere I can, actually. It just makes things easier. I will go ahead and name this layer. We'll call this background. And we have our UVs here. Let's go ahead and name this as well. We're going to call this UV layout. We're also going to lock this layer so that we don't accidentally nudge it or bump it or paint on it or do anything to it. All we want to do is be able to turn it on and turn it off. That is something to keep in mind too. If you forget and you leave this on, when you go back to see what your texture is doing, don't be surprised when you see a wireframe texture all over everything. So remember, before you send anything back over to Blender to see what it looks like, to take just a moment, reach up here and click that off. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is create a base color for our BananaMan's body. And we're going to keep this pretty simple. What I'm going to do is create a solid color layer, and of course he's a banana, so this needs to be kind of a nice brilliant yellow. I will desaturate it just a little bit, so not quite a fully saturated put your eyes out yellow, but still pretty bright. And we're going to call this body color. Like so. Now, with that done, I'm going to click on the layer mask for this new layer that I've created and hit Control-I, and that's going to remove that entirely. So it looks like we have no yellow left, and technically we don't. We're now going to paint that on by painting white onto the mask. So press the D key to activate your default colors of white and black, and make sure you have your paintbrush handy. Now, there's a couple of different ways we can do this. We could sit here and scribble. And there's nothing wrong with scribbling, but I want to do things just a slightly faster way. I'm going to come over to my lasso tool, hold down my left mouse button, and go down to the polygonal lasso, and I'm just going to click right around the fringes of each shape. Now, there's no reason why I couldn't just go ahead and fill the entire canvas with this body color. That's certainly one way to work, and it will get the same job done that I'm going to be doing here. I just happen to prefer having nice outlines for each one of my panels, just so that if later on I need to fit some other object's texture into the empty spaces, it's pretty apparent where that can happen without having to necessarily have this particular UV layout loaded in. It just makes things easier to read. But again, if you just feel better dropping yellow all over everything, technically that's just fine. Okay, now with that done, let's hold down Alt and hit the Delete key, and that will fill that in with yellow. Now, as once more, just kind of as a matter of preference, which is pretty much the reason I've done everything in this video series, I'm going to nuke out these little holes here where the arms are. So we'll just delete that. Control D. And the great thing about using the polygonal lasso tool is that you're already following polygons, so it makes everything real easy to get base level of precision down. Okay, let's do the same thing for the leg holes here. We'll delete that. Control D to deselect. And same thing over here. Now you'll notice that I am leaving a little bit of a buffer zone. I'm not going right up against those UVs. I'm leaving just a little bit of room there for some bleed over. That's going to be important if I do decide to scale this whole thing down. Because when that happens, you may end up with pixels that maybe contract in or some anti-aliasing lines that could bleed over the seams of your object. So having just those extra few pixels can really help out. Also later on, if we were to load this into a game engine, if there's any kind of MIP mapping taking place, and what MIP mapping is the texture will simplify itself as you get further away from the object. Then having just a few pixels bled over the edge of your object can help you solve seam problems later on. Now, if you start testing too much, no, I don't mean to say it like that. If you start testing and you notice there's still some seams that are appearing, you may want to increase that bleed over depending on your mip-map settings. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, then just remember that I said that, and yeah, we'll just go from there. Now let's go ahead and put some yellow on the arms. So let me back up a little bit. I'm going to make sure that I keep that a little bit thicker of a border. Now there's another way to do this that would work. As a matter of fact, you've seen how to do this with the lasso tool, and just because I want to show neat things, like whenever I get a chance, watch this. We're going to hit Escape, and I'm going to hold down Control and click on my UV layout. Let's just see what we get. So it says that okay, so what it's doing is it's selecting the lines. I was kind of hoping it would go a different route. All right, well, let me see if I can work around that. We'll hit Control-D. Let me try my Magic Wand tool. I've got to know if that'll work. So Control-D to deselect. Let me grab the Magic Wand tool, and I'm going to click out here in space. Oh, let's make sure we're on the UV layout. So we'll click out here. That worked. Hold down Shift, click here and here. So that grabs all of these spaces. Now watch this. Hit Control-Shift I, as long as I have focus here inside the view, Control-Shift-I, and that should grab the inside of those areas. Now, let's get even fancier. Hang on, watch this. Let's go ahead and disable our layer mask. Actually, I'm going to delete it altogether for the time being, and I'll turn this layer off. So you've seen this. We've got our selection. We've inverted it. Now let's go to Select, and we'll go to Modify, and we will expand that selection by, let's say 4 pixels. That may be too much, but we'll try it anyway. 4 doesn't look half bad. Let me undo that, and I'm going to go up by 6 pixels. So modify, expand, let's go with 6 pixels, and click OK. There we go. Nice, big, thick border around everything. So now I can take our body color layer here and just drop on a layer mask, and check it out. We have all these nice panels already filled with yellow. Pretty convenient, if I do say so myself. Now, let's go ahead and save this out. So Control-Alt-Shift-S, and just go ahead and click Save. And we'll select our Banana Man diffuse. There we go. And we'll go ahead and replace. That's fine. Now let's switch back over to Blender. And we'll reload the image that we have. And our Banana Man turns a brilliant yellow, which is a good sign. That's what we want to see, is that everything is coming over. Now, currently, this is, of course, pretty dull, and it's hard to tell really what's going on. So let's make a couple more changes to our texture before we call it even. If we go ahead and turn on our UV layout, we can see a few obvious things. We can see where the boots are, and obviously those will need to be a different color. So the way I want to handle that, as I get focused back here where I need it to be, is I'm going to hold down Control and click on the body color layer mask, which gives us, of course, all of our yellow areas selected again. Now, I'm going to switch back over to the polygonal lasso, but underneath the settings for it, I'm going to switch over to intersect with selection. Then, I'm just going to make a very, very careful selection that just encompasses the boots and nothing else. And the neat thing about doing this
is that this will combine the two selections that we have, so that now all I have selected is the boots. Now, here's where it gets kind of cool. We're going to take our body color layer, and with this still selected, I'm going to hit delete. And that removes out all of that yellow that we had around those pixels. Very nice. Now, with that still selected, we'll go over to solid color, and let's just choose a color for the boots. How about like a nice blue? And click OK. So now if I go ahead and turn off the UV layout, Control, Alt, Shift, S, save, go ahead and cover over the diffuse, and we'll go ahead and hit replace, jump back over, and we need to just click our reload button here inside of Blender, and there we go. The boots, of course, turn bright blue. Perfect. Alright, so now let's jump back over into Blender, and we can do this at least once more for the gloves. So I'm going to hold down Control and click on Body Color. Make sure my my polygonal lasso is still selected and that we are on intersect mode still. And we will turn on our UV layout because it's a little easier to see what's going on that way. And I'll clip right through here and come around this little piece of the glove. Actually, let me back up one. Hit backspace. There we go. And I'm just going to carefully maneuver my points right in through here. Brilliant. And then we can just carve around here. It doesn't matter if we get sloppy now. Double click, and there we go. That's all we have. Down on the body color layer, hit delete. Oh, now if you get this, don't worry about the little warning. That just means that you did not have the layer mask selected. So just click once on that layer mask so that you can hit delete and remove out those yellow pixels. Technically they were white pixels, but they were white pixels making a yellow area. If that doesn't bake your noodle, then good on you. Now let's, we need to name our boots color. So let's call this boots base color. Because we're probably going to have a couple of colors for the boots. Next, let's drop on another solid color layer. And I don't know what color boxing gloves can really be except for red. I mean, they kind of have to be red. That's just how it works. So we'll call this gloves base color. And let's go ahead and turn off our UV layout, and we'll hit Control, Alt, Shift, S. And we'll save that out. Just go ahead and save over our original image, jump back over to Blender, and reload once more. And there we go. So we have blue shoes, we have red gloves, we have a yellow body, and everything is updating the way it should. Now that puts us about 15 minutes in, so I'm going to go ahead and call the video here. And when we get back, we're going to take a look at gradually adding more and more detail to this texture. Again, though, I do want to give you kind of a heads up. I'm not going to be showing you how to make, like a $10 million texture here. I just want to get a few points across and show you some interesting tricks that can hopefully help you get started in making your own textures. But that'll wrap things up for this video. I do want to thank all of our viewers out there, and especially a huge thank you to all of our member sponsors. Take it easy. Greetings and welcome back. In this video we are going to continue with the texturing process for our banana character. Now I do want to throw this out there. I am making a lot of this up as I go along, so if I am working and I'm doing something to the texture and I suddenly change my mind and think I want to go in a different direction, that sometimes happens. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. But in this video, I do want to focus primarily on the boots for our character. So what I'm going to do to get us started is, well, I'm going to start organizing our layers. It's never too soon to be organized with a Photoshop file. So I'm going to take our body color layer, and I'm going to drag this down into a group, which I will call body. I'm going to change the name of this layer to body base color. And we'll go ahead and collapse that down. Let's take the boots, drag that down into their own group as well, which we'll just call boots. Collapse that down. We'll take the gloves, same thing. Call that gloves. And there we go. Now the reason I'm doing this is that as we continue to work, I'm going to be adding more and more layers onto our texture, and I don't want to get confused with what goes where, and ideally I should be able to just kind of glance at the file and say, alright, inside of this group will be all of the different layers which make up the texture for the boots, or for the gloves, the body, and so on. So again, just an organizational thing. So first off, we have the boots base color, and that's pretty cool, but you know, generally, when I'm looking at boots, and I'm not even thinking of boxing boots, well, I guess you could look at them that way. I keep thinking of like the old 1980s wrestling star boots. You know, you get those boots that kind of like go almost up to your knee and were always brilliantly colored and looked awesome. So that's kind of what this guy's wearing, you know. So we need some sort of a sole for the shoes that's not the same color. I'm thinking it should be a bright white. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can make that happen. So I'll jump back over to Photoshop and let's turn on our UV layout. And identifying the sole of our boots is pretty easy. We've just got this flat surface here, which looks like a great big footprint, very convenient. And then we have this little strip which is going to wrap around the outside. So what we're going to do is make sure that that is nice and white. There's a few ways to go about this. What I'm going to do is hold down Control and click on the layer mask for our boots base. Same as I did in the previous video, I'm going to grab the polygonal lasso and make sure I'm in intersection mode. And I'm just going to click right between these two shapes and carefully trim out the sole of the boot, like so. And we can overlap with that yellow area. It won't make any difference for what we're doing here. And I'm going to go ahead and hit delete. Oh, and again, when you get this, make sure you've selected the layer style, the layer mask, thank you. Hit delete. And we'll go ahead and drop on a new solid color layer, which I'll just make white. And it's probably a good idea not to make it completely white. You know, some sort of off-white will probably work out better, just in case, you know, we pull this into a game engine or anything like that, and we have something that actually needs to be 100% completely white. I try not to work in absolutes if I don't have to, meaning I try to avoid full black, and I try to avoid full white whenever I can, just in case there's some sort of an effect that is that's got to overlay an existing color. Okay, and we need to call this boot sole color. So now we know what that is. So let's go ahead and hold down Control, and we'll click on the layer mask again for our boots base color. And once again, with the polygonal lasso, I'm just going to carefully snip around this little stripe area. Cut right in between here. Those are a little close, but that should be all right. And there we go. So let's make sure we select the boots base layer, hit delete, and make sure you select the layer mask again, hit delete, and then come up here to boot sole, and we're going to hold down Alt and hit delete. And that will fill that in with a white color. So let's hit Control D to deselect. We'll turn off our UV layout. And once again, let's do a quick save test. So Control Alt Shift S and save. Select our file, overwrite, which is fine. Jump back over to Blender and reload. And there we go. So we've already got a little bit of detail starting to show up. Okay, now the next thing, because I want to keep this fairly simple, let's go ahead and define where the tongue of this boot would be. Because I'm thinking, you know, that's going to have to start here at the front of the boot and run all the way down the toe, almost to the end of the toe, where it's just going to curve up here, and that'll be our goal. So let's hit Alt-Tab, make it back over to Photoshop, and we'll take a look at our UV layout. It's fortunately pretty easy to see where that's going to be. We have some geometry which is kind of outlining that. To help show this, though, I'm going to create a brand new layer. I'm not going to name it yet. Let me decide what I'll name it while I paint on it for just a moment. In fact, this is just going to be more of a test than anything else. I have orange as my paintbrush color right now, and that should be just fine. I'll make sure I have my brush out, and I'm going to make my brush size very, very small. And let's just paint a stripe. And I'm following this line of detail carefully down the toe of the boot. Also, keep in mind that I am using a digital stylus. I'm not doing this with my mouse. If you had to do it with your mouse, that's fine. You know, we work with the tools we have on hand, and that's totally cool. But if you're fortunate enough to have something like a Wacom tablet or something like that, I highly recommend that you utilize it for work like this. So we have this traced out. Let's go ahead and just save that out and see what that looks like. You'll notice I did, of course, turn off my my UV layout before I did this. And we'll jump back over to Blender again and reload. And that's looking pretty good. We've got a little bit of odd stretching behavior taking place here, so we can't really follow that detail. We kind of need to go a little bit on the outside of it, and that's totally cool and very easy to accomplish. A few ways we could do it. We could just redraw the line, or we could use something like Liquify. Since we're just kind of testing things out, we're just kind of getting a general feel for where certain lines should be. I'm going to do it the simple way, which is just erase what we have and trace a wider line, like so. Clean that up with the eraser a little bit, and just perform another test. Now, don't be surprised if you find yourself having to do these tests a few times just to make sure that everything is landing exactly where it needs to go. So we'll save, replace, jump back over to Blender, and looks like I'm actually painting kind of on the wrong side, so I should be painting more toward this side. That's okay. Let me jump back over to Photoshop. I'll hit Control-Alt-Z, and we'll pull that first seam back that I just painted, which is just like that. Now let's try something else. Let's get a little fancy here. I'm just going to make a marquee selection right about here, hit Control-T, hold down the Alt key, and rotate that out a little bit. So that was easy. Now let's do a quick save test. Now I am going to quit calling out my hotkeys for those save tests. It's something I'm sure you guys can knock out on your own very quickly. And there we go. So that's coming along. A little bit of texture stretching here. Let me try something real quick. If we go back into our object and take a look at his UVs, how bad is that stretching really going to be biting us, I wonder? So if I grab, let's see here. Yeah, we could probably straighten it back out at the UV level if we really wanted to. There is a little bit of stretching kind of going on here that wasn't all that prevalent when we were looking at the, or at least it wasn't obvious. I didn't really notice it when we were playing with the checker texture. So it is something that we're probably going to have to address once we get in. I don't want to let it bog us down too much right now because it is something I can patch up later very quickly just by waggling a few UVs around. And don't be surprised if you find yourself having to kind of go a little bit back and forth with your model on getting the UVs kind of patched up from time to time, especially if you're just doing a down and dirty layout like we did. So with that done, we kind of have a general idea of where our tongue is going to be. I'm going to call this layer temp underscore, or we don't need an underscore, boot tongue. Now we'll turn on our UV layout, and let's go ahead. We'll drop on yet another layer, and this will be the real thing. So actually, you know what? I'm going to make this another solid color layer. We're going to make it something very close to white, and I'm going to call this boot highlights. Or, well, I guess highlights will work just as well as anything else. But the idea is I want to create these lines, and as well as a few others, with something I can change the color on a little later. So let's zoom in here. I'm going to get really, really close. And I'll get my paintbrush out. And I'm just going to carefully scribble. Now, in this case, I'm starting off by coloring just inside that first line. Now, that is just the thickness of the boot at the very top, right where it meets his leg. So now, we'll scribble down here and then down here, just like the thickness of one brush. If you're not careful, and you have two different thicknesses on either side, that will result in a visible seam. So you do have to be a little precautious about that. Now, leaving things just like that, there are a few things we could do at this point. Let me turn off my UV layout. We can go ahead and fill this in if we have any stray pixels in there. Now, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. We could include the stripes for the tongue right here at this point. Or we could not. Let me go ahead and turn those off for just a minute. Yeah, I'm kind of, like I said, I'm doing this very much on the fly. So let me go ahead and I'm going to duplicate this layer. I'm going to hit Control-A and delete. And the reason is I want this second highlight thing. We're going to call this boot tongue outline. This is going to be the area I use to outline the tongue. They can be the same color, but they don't necessarily have to be. And you'll see why here in just a second. There really is a method to why I'm doing this. But I'm going to carefully scribble right down these lines and fill these in. Like so. And then back up the other side. Okay, now let's turn off that temporary layer for just a moment. We'll back out and let's save this out. So make sure I have focus. Whenever you hit the Alt key, Photoshop's focus gets a little bit interesting. Jump back over to Blender and there we go. So we got that white stripe. Oop, don't want to move vertices, so careful when you're navigating. It is a good idea to double check right in here at your seam. And you can see that we are getting some different thicknesses here for our seam. Now, when the character is viewed at any kind of longish distance, I mean, I'm anticipating this guy being viewed from about back here during game time, and that's about as close as we get. This is about as detailed as I think we really need to go, but we do need to pay attention to texture jaggies like we see there, as well as seams that we get on the inside of the leg. Now, those seams we can handle in two different ways. We know that the texture has the right thickness. We know that we're using about the same number of pixels. It was about the width of one paintbrush. We can add a little more thickness at the seams, but to me that's kind of like battling yourself. That's kind of fighting back and forth. What I'll do is I'll just keep on doing what I'm doing and getting the boot texture looking steadily nicer and nicer. And then we'll go back and we'll make some little tweaks here and there to the UVs to kind of straighten everything up. So it's kind of a back and forth process for us. Alright, so I'm seeing I got a funny little white dot floating right in there, and that's interesting. Let's go back over to Photoshop and see what that's all about. And I did have a funny white dot there. I didn't even notice that before. Okay, now, I told you earlier that I wanted to separate out the boot highlights, and there really was a reason for that. Let's go ahead and jump over here into our layer styles, and I'm going to put a drop shadow on here. I'm going to move the drop shadow here just underneath, like so. And actually, you know what? Come to think of it, I'm not going to use a drop shadow. Let me turn that off. I'm going to do an outer glow. And the cool thing about using an outer glow is it's like a drop shadow you don't have to direct. It just kind of goes everywhere. We're going to make this black, and we're going to set the blend mode over to normal. We can increase the size a little bit and pull down the opacity because we're just trying to tint those colors. We can add a little bit of noise to it so it's not quite so perfect. And click OK. Now, I would also like to see a little bit of the same thing taking place inside where our tongue is. And that's kind of an interesting thing to play with. The way we're going to do that is like so. I'm going to create, well, we have our little tongue stripes. Let's see, right underneath those, let's make another layer. And this layer can be empty. And I'm going to call this tongue shadow. Now here's where we get fancy. I don't know if you've ever seen tricks like this in Photoshop, but it is a neat trick to use. If I can just paint any blob you like, so there's just a blob of color. Then let's go over to our layer styles, which I just do by double clicking on the layer. And we're going to put an inner shadow in here. No, let's do inner glow, just like before. So we'll do inner glow. We'll make this black. And we'll set the blend mode over to normal. And we'll give this a little bit of noise as well. Then I'm going to go over to my blending options and set fill opacity down to 0. Click OK. Now check this out. I can just carefully paint right along the inside of the tongue area. And go ahead and blow my brush up a little bit, make this a little easier. And right along in there, I'm automatically adding in some shadow. Now it's getting a little bit sparsely placed as we get here toward the end, so we can go ahead and jump into the effects real quick. We can grab Inner Glow. We can boost the size slightly. And I'll pull down the noise just a smidge. There we go. And we'll color that all the way down. Now, here's where it gets cool. We're going to paint this out past the end of the toe. And technically that works. I mean, we can even, if we want to, we could do this. We could chop it off and then take our little tongue stripey thingy. And if I grab my layer here, we could just paint a stripe right across, and that would be fine. And we'd want it to look nicer than what I just painted. But I do want to show you a trick. If we grab our tongue shadow layer, and I keep on painting out here past the end, we also have the option of doing this. We can drop a layer mask onto this layer. We can go to the blending options and say Layer Mask Hides Effects. Click OK. So just real quick, if you missed that, under Blending Options, switch on Layer Mask Hides Effects. Then, make sure you have the layer mask selected, hit D and then X to paint the color black, and now you can paint away that little shadow. Now, why would I go through all this much trouble just to paint a simple shadow? Well, that's because while I'm working now, I can double-click, I can go into my Inner Glow settings, and I can change how that shadow looks. I can make it bigger, I can make it smaller, I can take away noise or add noise, I can make it darker, I can make it lighter. I have all kinds of control over how that looks. So let's click OK. We'll go ahead and save this out. Jump back over to Blender and go ahead and reload. And there we go. Now, there are some areas where this can be cleaned up. I'll be the first to admit that the lines there can be a little bit adjusted. Of course, we have some zigzagginess going on here at the top of the boot. I'm not really stressed about that at the moment, though. That's something that we can clean up as we move forward. Right now, I'm just getting a few things in place to help you see where we're going with the texture, and then I can kind of start moving steadily quicker and quicker as we roll. So that is going to wrap things up for this video. I'd like to thank everybody for watching, and of course a huge thank you to all of our member sponsors, and I'll see you on the next video. Alright, we're back, and we are still texturing out the boots for our Banana Man character. And I noticed, and actually we saw this quite obviously in the last video, we've got this funny little distortion problem down here. And part of that is just due to the automatic layout that we had for our UVs. It just led to some texture stretching issues that we need to go ahead and get cleaned up before we get too much further along. Now, there are probably some ways we could manipulate the pixels to make that less apparent, but I would just as soon go ahead and adjust the UVs just a bit so that we can continue painting on how we were. Now, this does mean something. This means that our UV layout will be a little different between Photoshop and Blender. If that really, really bothers you, then of course you can go ahead and just do another export and bring in a new UV layer if you need to. However, I don't think I really need to do that because in the end, once I have the basics down, such as the overall shape of where things are going to go on the boot, then I'll be paying more attention to the layout and less attention to what those UVs are saying. So I don't mind just kind of matching one up to the other and moving on from there with no concerns. So let's take a look at fixing this UV problem. I'll go ahead and tap A to select all of my faces. And it's a pretty easy task, but it is one that if you're unfamiliar with working between UVs and 3D models that you might have to take your time on, what I'm going to do is hit the B key to create a marquee selection. I'll grab this little UV here right next to the tongue of our boot. And I'll hit the G key for moving, and I'm just going to slide this out a little bit. And you can see over inside the 3D viewport how that's kind of cleaning up that distortion a little bit. Now let's go ahead and just click over here onto one of these UVs, hit B again. And the reason I clicked was just to make sure that this guy gets deselected. And we'll hit G once more and slide this over. Now what I'm doing is I'm just trying to straighten out that line here for the tongue as best I can. It doesn't have to be super perfect, but really anything would be better than it was. So let's go back over here, hit B, select again, and I'll hit G and kind of pull this back a little. We may have to go, well, I'm sure we will have to go in and kind of touch up what the texture is doing after we do this, but it shouldn't be that bad. Now, let's see here. Let's grab our box one more time. Actually, let me right-click. I'm just going to select one of these UVs first, drag over the box, hit G, and I'm just going to slide that over a little bit to make some room so we don't have too much texture stretching going on. I'm okay with the thickness we have here and here. It's just right there in between. We've got this sort of curvature that's swooping down, and we will have to take a look at fixing that. Let's click here, grab another box, select, hit G, and that's kind of helping to straighten that out a little more. And that looks pretty good. And even just with that much of a change, if we go ahead and hit A to deselect, hit Tab to get out of edit mode, that looks a whole lot cleaner than what we had just a few moments ago. So we'll go ahead and roll with that. Now let's jump back over here to Photoshop, and if we turn our UVs on, we can see, even though they are a little different, we can see that we had that kind of down swooping area right in here where the tongue meets this upper bar. I'm going to push that away by taking my boot highlight layer, and we're going to grab the smudge tool, which is located here underneath the blur tool. And let's see, let's make sure I have my layer mask selected, and I'll make my brush nice and big. And I'm just going to nudge that up a little bit. Now, I also like going kind of underneath it and pushing up. That kind of helps de-smooth it a little bit. You can also sharpen it a bit by going under Filter, Sharpen, and let's just do a regular sharpen. And that probably didn't help as much as I wanted it to, but that's kind of how it works sometimes. Let me get my paintbrush back out. I'll make my brush nice and small. And what am I painting? I'm painting black, so let's hit X so I'm painting white. And we sort of fill that in. Okay, now I should go ahead and take a quick look and see how that looks. So I'm going to do a real quick save and shift over. So save, boom, save, yes, replace, jump over to Blender, reload, and that snugged that up. It's not absolutely perfect, but I think for the purposes of the video it's going to work out just fine. So we'll go ahead and go with that for now. Back over here inside of Photoshop, I'm going to take my boot tongue stripes here. It's these two stripes on either side of the tongue, and I'd like to kind of even those out a little bit. So let's take a look at doing that. Let's increase the size of my brush just a little, and I'm just going to very carefully run right down that, sort of scribbling as I go, and just trying to keep an eye on overall thickness of the line, because in some places it does get really, really thin. Whoop, and I don't need to do what I just did, which apparently was hold down Alt and make a move there. And I'm pretty sure that happened because I must have nudged one of the buttons on my tablet. So let me go ahead and make sure that my sleeve is clear of that. I do try to deactivate those buttons, and I've recently had to reinstall my drivers, so yeah. Go ahead and pull that back. Come back over here and keep right on painting. Now, obviously, if this is a real boot, there would be some sort of line division here along the top cross white stripe there, showing where the band that goes around the cuff of the boot was versus the little seams around the tongue here. We're going to make those into kind of like a final detail layer that goes on top of everything. So for the time being, don't stress that. Let's do a couple of other things, though, as well. We've got our little shading layer here, and if we open up the layer styles for that by double-clicking on the effects, and we bring up our fill opacity, you'll see there were some areas that we missed in here that did not get painted orange. Now, of course, we don't see orange because we're pulling that fill opacity all the way down to 0, but it would be nice if we had a nice uniform painting in here. So here's how I'm going to fix that. I'm going to hold down Alt and click on the visibility button for that layer, and I'm also going to switch off my effects for the time being. And I can just fill this in manually. Now, currently, it looks like the blend mode of my brush is set to screen, and I don't want that. I'm going to set that back over to normal, and we'll just continue on painting, and I'm just going to fill in any half-scribbled pixels within that shape. Once that's done, I can Alt-click on the Visibility tab for this once again, and let's go ahead and just kind of get right up underneath the edges. We don't want to go too far under, but this should work pretty well. And fill that in. And there we go, much, much cleaner. Now we can go back into the effects, turn those back on, open this up, and bring our fill back down, and we just have a much nice, cleaner fill overall. I'm going to pull the noise down just a little bit and pick the size up slightly. Now that does lead to some pretty heavy darkening up here up top, so I'm going to bleed back the opacity just a little, and that'll be fine because I'm now going to take those two stripes that we put on either side of the tongue, and we're going to give those a little bit of shading as well. Now, if anybody's curious as to why I'm using layer styles for a lot of this shading, the big reason is it's faster. You can hand paint these all day long if you like, and generally I like to, but setting these up through procedural methods, I've just found is a much quicker setup, which is great, for when you're making, training and expecting people to watch you. I didn't mean to do an inner glow. Let me actually do an outer glow, and we want to make that black, and set the blend mode over to normal, and increase the size a bit, pull the opacity down a little bit, play with noise. We want this to be kind of subtle, really. Okay, and there we go. So now we've got a little bit of darkening there. Now, the next thing I want to do is take a look at creating some shading along the bottom of the boot. And to do that, I'm going to hold down Control and select our boot color layer. Actually, you know what? Bear with me a second. I'm thinking. Yeah, I am going to have to do it this way. Let's go right over the boot color layer, and I'm going to drop on a new empty layer, which I'll just call boot base shading, which I should be adding spaces in there for consistency, but so there we go. Now let's fill this in. So once again, I'm just going to hold down Alt and hit Delete, and that'll fill this in with orange. Do not worry about the pixels that are actually in there. We're going to be jumping right into our layer style and taking the fill opacity to 0 anyway. Now we'll do another inner glow. We'll set this to black just like we did before. We'll take the blend mode and set it over to normal. We'll increase the size quite a bit and increase the noise just a little so it's not perfect shading. And there we have it. Now, the problem with what I just did is this. If we go ahead and do a quick save, make sure I have focus here inside of Photoshop. Save, click, jump over here, replace, go over to Blender, and refresh. We do get some nice shading, which takes place around the bottom of the boot. I like that. But we're also getting this really nasty shading here at the seam, and that's a problem. I don't like that. Also, mental note, we need to clean up where these textures meet each other, which I'll deal with that in just a bit. So I don't want to draw so much attention to the seam. That's okay. I can deal with that fairly easily. I also wouldn't mind the shading here on the underside of the boot being a tad more pronounced. So let's focus on that first. To do that, we'll go back into our boot base shading layer, go back into our inner glow settings, and let's just choke this in a little bit. So we'll grab choke. Probably a good thing to do here would be to turn on our UV layout, because that'll show us how far in that shading is going. And I'm actually going to turn, well, I'd like to turn the opacity down on that, but it's currently locked, so we'll unlock it. I'll pull the opacity down to something I can just barely see. And then we'll lock it back, just so I don't do something stupid to it. Now let's open up our settings once again. I'm going to take my inner glow, and we'll choke that in a ways, say right about there, and then play with our size. Now let's see how horrible that looks. Hopefully it's not too bad. And we'll do Control-Shift-Alt-S, save, hit the button, go back over to Blender, hit the reload button, and there we go. So that darkens up the underside of the boots quite a bit more, and I like that. I dig it. But again, we are really drawing a lot of attention to that seam, which is, of course, problematic. So let's solve that problem next. The way we can solve that problem, well, there's a couple of different ways we can solve that problem. One way is to go back over to Photoshop, and let's go ahead and turn our UVs on for just a moment. One way is to just extend the influence of this layer out a little bit further. So let me take my fill and I'll just bring it up a little bit so we can kind of see what's going on. Now if I get my paintbrush back out and make sure we're painting on this layer, I can just bleed the effect out a little ways. And let me increase my brush size a little bit. And as I do that, you can see what that's doing to my shading. It's just pushing it away. I do have to be a little careful doing this, though, because I can end up running that shading into another piece of geometry. So it's just one of those go real slowly kinds of things. And it won't always work. If it doesn't work for what it is you're working on, like here, I may end up pushing that over into the little Banana Man layer, or over into his skin. If that doesn't work, you just have to fix it, which we can do that too. So let me go ahead and I'll just extend this out. And I'm kind of following the thickness of the geometry a little bit. And there you go. And we'll do that over here as well. So we'll paint this straight out. There you go. There you go. Beautimous. I like it. Now, that we are kind of hidden behind the soul area. So we could fix this just by layering, and what I mean by that is we could take our body layer and we could put it up on top of our boots layer, and suddenly that's not a problem. It bleeds over, and we don't have any issue with that. But that is kind of a lazy way to go about it. A much cleaner way to go about it. Let's go ahead and put the body back down underneath everything. It doesn't really matter which way you do it. I just don't like doing it that way. We can grab our boots base shading layer. And let's go ahead and make sure in our blending options that once again we turn on layer mask hides effects. Then we just add a layer mask to this whole thing and make sure we're painting the color black, which I did just by tapping the X key. And now we can just scribble out those areas. You have to have that checkbox on though. If you don't have that checkbox on, this will change the shape of your shadow. So just be aware of that. So now I can paint this back in. And actually, you know what? Let me make my brush nice and tight real quick. There we go. That's clean. I like it. Now, of course, we don't want to leave our boots orange. Well, I mean, maybe you do. Orange boots are cool. But if you want to make the boots orange, change the base color. And don't do it this way. Now, let's make sure we open this back up, set our fill back over to 0. Click OK. Control, Alt, Shift, and S. Save. Replace, and let's go back over to Blender, take a close look at that seam, and we reload. I left my UVs on. I knew it was going to happen sometime before the videos were over, didn't you? I mean, at some point we're just like, I just can't wait for him to do that so I can point and laugh at the screen. Well, hopefully you pointed and you laughed, and we're all better people for it. So now we reload, and that seam is pretty much non-existent. There's a couple of areas where it jumps out just a little bit, but it's so subtle that from any viewing distance, I'm not going to stress about it. So yeah, now we've got a little bit of shading on the underside of the boot. Now that puts us about 15 minutes in, so I'm going to go ahead and call things right here. I just wanted to thank all of our viewers for the support that you guys give us, and especially to our member sponsor viewers who make everything we do at 3D Buzz possible. And I will catch you on the next video. Take it easy. Okay, we're back, and in this video, my goal is to get us away from the boots for now, so we've got a little bit of work to do. I want to put on some boot laces, and I want to break up the texture around the boot soles a little bit. We're not going to worry about putting an underside to the soles on just yet. I'll deal with that maybe a little ways down the road, and then maybe we might also stick some sort of a logo on the outside of the heel. But let's go ahead and jump in without any further ado. So, to put some laces on, I want to do this in kind of a multi-stage process. So let's jump over to Photoshop. And I've got all of this stuff that I've got going on here. I'm going to put all of this into its own subgroup, which I'm just going to call the upper, which is, as far as I can tell, that's an actual shoe term, if I remember correctly. Now, I want to put on some grommets for the boot laces to go through. So let's do that first. I'll make a layer, and let's call this layer, actually I don't want to do that. I want to double click this layer and call it grommets. And, I'll make it a solid color layer. I don't really have to do that, but I will anyway. And we'll go ahead and invert the layer mask for it, and I'll make this a medium to lightish gray for now. Okay, now there's a couple of different ways I could go about doing this whole thing. What I'm going to do is grab my paintbrush and make sure I'm on the layer mask itself. Now I'm not using my stylus, I'm just going to be using my mouse. I'm going to grab a nice hard brush, and let's just try this. Let's click, and I can't see what's... Oh, because I'm painting black. Haha. Let's hit X. And then I can click, click, click. I'm just trying to space these out relatively evenly. Okay. Now before I even do anything else, let's just see how those look on the surface. So hit save, jump over here, yeah, replace, go to Blender, reload, and yeah, they get a little bit distorted in size. I kind of thought they might. I'm thinking I can fix that manually through brush size. I can fix that through UVs. We've already mucked around with the UVs a little bit here. Let me see if I can just take a look at that, and we'll just jump on it from that angle. Tab, let's hit A to grab everything, and so if I just start off here, this probably is not going to do what I want it to, but I'm going to try anyway. You know, let's just jump in. So let's see, if I start pulling this down a ways, it starts to snug that up in that direction. And if you take a look at the shape that's actually here on the boot, if you try to mock that shape, you'll end up with something that's actually pretty close. So I am limited, though, in how I can handle all that. So let's, well, that's what happens. Grab here, hit G, and that's kind of working on the back there, which is fine. That guy right there is my main cause for concern, but that's okay. It's what I do here. I have to come up with solutions on the fly while I record the videos. So let's do another box, hit G, we'll pull this up. That kind of starts to straighten that out. I can just make the grommet size smaller there, and that should be alright. I still get a little bit of funky distortion right up in there that I'm not a big fan of, to be sure. Let's see. I'm doing crazy things with the vertex to see where I could potentially put it to make that go away. And it looks like it's just kind of some distortion I'm going to have to sort of live with. Otherwise, I'm going to have to do some real serious replacing of my UVs. And I don't really want to do that. Okay, so that's enough to kind of get us rolling, at least there. So let's see. Let's make another one here, and I'll waggle this guy around just a little. Really what I'm looking for is ones that are kind of oblong looking, and seeing what I can do to make them look a little better. I mean, a little oblong is okay, but we just don't want them to be too terribly oblong. Yeah, that's helping. And aside from that one at the end, they're actually starting to look pretty good. So if I grab this guy here, put a box around him, and hit G to move him around. So if I slide him out a little ways, that helps. So I'm not going for absolute perfection here if you hadn't yet caught on to that. I'm just trying to get something that looks a little bit cleaner than it did. So now let's jump back over to Photoshop, and I'm going to do a couple of things. Let's grab the Marquee Selection tool. I'm going to grab this guy and hit Control-T and just scale this one little guy down. So he's just smaller, and that should help kind of solve that problem. Now let's go ahead and place grommets on the opposite sides as well. Do a real quick save so we see kind of what these look like. Jump back over to Blender and reload. And a little stretched as well. Let's see if we can just put a little bit of love time in on these to make them look a little nicer. So grab here, drag a box. You have to drag a box, remember, because you have stacked UVs here. So that's going to be important. And I think what I'm going to do is just scale the first couple of them down and probably call it even there. So here, grab box, G, and can't do too much there, can we? And what I'm looking at is this guy right here. He's just really funky looking. That helped. Again, it's not perfect, but it'll get the job done. So now let's just go back over to Photoshop. And that's not Photoshop. That's Photoshop. And again, I'll grab Marquee Selection Tool. We'll grab this guy, Control-T, scale him down a little bit, press Enter. All right, cool. Now, we have some basic grommets in place, so let's do some things. Let's double-click to grab our layer styles again. Once again, I'm just reminding you that I'm using these layer styles just as kind of a cheat, because it's just easier. So let's see. If I grab an inner glow, and this is a real interesting trick. You can take this one home with you. Let's go ahead and make that normal and set it to black. And then I'm going to take the source and set it to center, put the opacity up to full, bring the size actually up a little bit, increase the choke size. There we go. And that just turns those into little black dots, so that we can play with those a little more easily. Then we could drop on a basic bevel and emboss. And then, let's see, we can take the shadow mode and pull down its opacity. The highlight mode, we can pull that down a little bit as well. Size, we can kind of just mess around with until we kind of like the way it looks. We can do an outer glow, set that to normal and to black. Pull down the opacity quite a bit, bring the size down to tighten them up, nice and snug. Maybe put a little bit of noise on there too. Now let's just test that out real quick. So we have like Instagrommets, right? So Control-Alt-Shift-S, and save, and replace. Ooh, and let's do this too. Let's make sure that we do save our document. I'm actually kind of embarrassed. I've gone through these videos left and right without saving my document. So we'll call this bananaman_diff for diffuse and maximize our compatibility. That way we're not losing our Photoshop work, which is good. And let's reload. And there we go. So we can get out of there, and we have our little Instagrommets running down the sides of the boot. And from any decent distance, it's pretty apparent what it is you're looking at. Okay, killer. Let's keep on jamming, because I really do want to get the boots pretty much wrapped up. So now I want to do some boot laces. So let's make another solid color layer. And again, just to keep mentioning this, because I'm sure one or two of you might be going, why does he always do solid color layers? The reason is so that we can do things like this. Like I can go to the upper and I can say, you know what, I wanted my boots to be green, and suddenly my boots are green. And the highlights around the tongue, I actually wanted those to be orange. And so you have all this real quick, rapid adjustment ability that you just didn't have previously. So I like using those whenever I can, especially when I'm trying to lock down a design and it's possible somebody may come by and say, hey, that looks really good, but can I see it in red? Oh, then you can do it in red. So now, let's come over here. Let's name our new color fill Boot Lace 1 as opposed to Boot Lace 2, and that will be important here in just a little bit. And actually, for the moment, I'm going to make this a brilliant red. That'll make things a lot easier to understand as we go. And let's bring down the brush size a bit. And all I'm going to do is just run across like so. And now you have to kind of think about where a real boot lace would end up going. So we would go out to here, and then it would go back up under the tongue, and it would go out to here, and then back up under the tongue. I'm going to draw it backwards because it's easier for me to do that way. And back out to this guy, and then to this guy, and then to this guy, and we'll call it right there. If you wanted to draw your own like bow at the top, you could totally do that. All right, now we're going to create another solid color layer, which, just for contrast's sake, I guess I could leave it at orange. That'll be fine. Just invert this layer mask to make it black, and we'll call this Boot Lace 2, and press Enter. Now, click on this, and this guy will go to here, and then to here. Actually, that's a little too curved, so boom. And then to here, fill that in a little better. And in doing this, we get that nice string overlapping effect. I will probably have to touch these guys up, though, because I'm getting some different thicknesses due to pressure sensitivity, but that's okay. Let me go ahead and just trace back over each one of these and try to apply equal solid pressure to each strand. That should make things a lot easier. And keep this technique in mind, because we'll probably use it again when we do the boxing gloves, because they've got laces as well. And come over here, and we'll just go back over these guys. Isn't that cool how that works? It's like the power of layering. Okay, cool. Now, all that done, let's do a couple of things here. Let's set these to some lacing color. So, I mean, white makes sense, but I would like to be able to differentiate them from anything else. So we'll have them just a little bit darker. I'm going to grab, well, I don't even have to grab that, AF. I could just type that because I can remember that. But let's go to our bootlace 2. We'll make that the same color with the hex code, so they're the same color. Let's go over to bootlace 1, and there's a few ways to go about what I want to do here. We could do something like a bevel and emboss, just pull the highlights pretty much off, or maybe just put a little bit on for good measure. And that's kind of a nice way to start. I'm going to pull the opacity down on the shadows as well. Let me turn off the global light, and we'll bring these in from the left. Now, to kind of help this out, I'm also going to do an inner glow of black with normal. And we'll make that very small, like a pixel. Okay. That didn't do what I wanted to. Let's just do away with that. Let's do a drop shadow. And drop shadow is a nice way to go about this. And we'll snug that up right underneath the laces. We don't want it to go too far because it starts to break the illusion, obviously. So we'll snug that right up underneath. And we'll bring the size down to make sure they're nice and tight. The default opacity is really not half bad. We can totally use that. And let's see, what else could we do? We could probably put a pattern on them if we wanted to kind of chunk them up a little bit. Grab bevel and emboss. We can't really put a noise on those. If I did that inner glow again, I could use that to noise these up a little and then really pull the opacity down, and that just kind of breaks those out a little bit. I can do a very subtle outer glow of black with normal and then make it almost completely transparent. It's just, well, I don't know. The more I kick it up, the more I kind of like it. So yeah, let's just go with that. So it's like an additional shadowing effect. Oh, okay. Now with all that in place, and you can see it's drop shadow, outer glow, inner glow, bevel and emboss. I'm just going to hold down Alt and drag that onto my other bootlaces, and there you have it. We've got laces. So let's hit Control Alt Shift S and save and jump over here, replace, and what's next? If we come back over to Blender. And there we go. We've got some laces on our guy's boots, which is pretty cool. Now, we're about 15 minutes in, and I really was serious about wanting to get away from the boots in this video, but it doesn't look like we're going to be able to do it. In the next video, I'm going to want to, well, okay, let me not say the next video. In an upcoming video, I might get away from the boots temporarily. We will break up the texture here on the bottom, put a sole on the underside of the boots, and then we can do like a final detail pass to make sure that the tongue is nicely separated and so forth. But I think that's going to wrap things up for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and of course a huge thank you to all of our member sponsors, and I'll catch you on the next video. Take care. Greetings and welcome back. We're still texturing up our little awesome Banana Man boxer guy. Now, I do feel like I should apologize for something, and I probably shouldn't apologize. I'm sure this is just fine, but I did say I wanted to wrap up the boots in the last video, and then I didn't, and I still have work that I want to do on the boots, so I'm just going to completely ignore the fact that I ever said I want to wrap up the boots, and I'm just going to keep working on them until they're done. I may finish them in this video, and I may finish them in the next video, and I hope that's okay. But the cool thing is it does allow me to show off some techniques that I otherwise would be unable to do. So, what I want to do in this video is put a sole on the underside of our little boots here. And there's a few tricks that I get to employ to do that. The first thing is we need to find a texture. You can create one of these, of course. You can hand draw it. You could go get a digital camera and you could take a picture of the sole of a shoe. Me, I'm going to cheat. And here's how I'm going to cheat. Here I have a picture from rubberimpex.com. It's a Chinese rubber importing site, apparently. And they have this really super generic rubber sole of a shoe that they apparently sell. And it just looked so perfectly generic that I thought it would work out really well for us. Now, it's extremely low quality. And under normal circumstances, I would say that that's kind of problematic. But under these circumstances, with something that's already fairly basic, I think this will work out great. So I'm going to right-click on this image and copy it. By the way, I'm not making any claim of ownership to this image, and I'm not redistributing it. By all means, look up something similar or take a picture of something on your end. Just kind of get the sort of a generic copyright disclaimer out of the way. Okay, so here we are inside of our texture file, and I'm going to take a look. Here we have the sole of our boot right there. I'm going to click right here and hit paste, and that brings this in as a layer, which is great. But if we take a look at its orientation, here this kind of looks like a footprint from a right shoe, and this looks like a footprint from a left shoe, so we need to flip this. So I'll hit Control-T, and we'll take our height and set that to -100, and that flips that over very nicely. Press Enter. Now, let's grab the Quick Select tool, and I'll quickly paint right down the inside of the shoe. Can you believe how quick that was? Just click and paint. It's because all of the underside of this shoe is pretty much the same color, so it works really well. I'll hold down Alt and paint away some of these areas where it's kind of bleeding over just a little bit. It does not have to be perfect, by the way. And then we'll hit Control-Shift-I. That inverts the selection so that I can hit Delete, and you see all that I have left is just this little shoe, which is awesome. Now, the next thing I want to do is boost the contrast on this and push it to black and white. I don't need any of the color data. So let's go to Image, Adjustments, and let's grab a black and white. We'll push the yellows up, pull the reds down. We'll keep this about mid-tone gray, so we keep as many of our different values in there as we can. Click OK, and then again, Image, Adjustments, let's do Levels. And just by bringing our white points and our black points a little closer together, we can boost that contrast a little bit. So that'll work pretty well, though I'm sure we'll end up bleeding back the opacity of that layer once we get it into place. Speaking of which, let's get it into place. So I'm going to turn on my UV layout so I can kind of see where things are supposed to be. And let's name this. This should have a name. Let's call this Boot Sole Tex. So we know that that's just specifically a texture. I know that sounds a little redundant because the whole thing is a texture, but it's just something to keep me sane and happy. So let's hit Control-T. We'll rotate this around. Let's scale things down a little bit and zoom in so we can kind of see what's going on here. Now, in the end, you kind of want this to be oversized. If it's got to be anything, you want it to be oversized. Because what we're going to do is make a layer mask that constrains this down to what we actually need. So you'll notice I'm just letting it kind of bleed over and color and cover over everything we need it to. We have more than enough ability. If we want to, we could use like something like Liquify and stretch this out, but I don't see the necessity in that at the moment. So I'm going to nudge this around a little bit. I kind of like it right there, but I don't like how it bleeds over onto other parts of the shoe. The reason I don't like that is this. Let's illustrate. If I hit Control-Alt-Shift-S and hit Save, jump over to my texture, do another Save As, Replace, jump to Blender, and reload. Then if we carefully look around, we have areas on the underside of the shoe where that's starting to bleed over and look pretty bad. But that does look like a boot sole, which is pretty nice. So let's clean this up and make it look a little better. First off, I'm going to take this boot sole texture and I'm going to hide it. Also, we have this temporary boot tongue layer I don't need anymore. I'm going to throw that away since I'm looking at it and I realize it's superfluous at this point. Let's turn on the UV layout layer again, and I'm going to grab my polygonal lasso tool, and I get to use it for one of my favorite things. Favorite reasons to even have it when I'm doing low poly UV layouts is that I can use it to trace out a quick UV layout. Now there's a couple of ways to do what I'm doing right now. We've already seen some of them where you do like a big magic wand tool for everything and then you can intersect a selection, and of course that's just fine, but I thought I'd throw this out there too. The only place where what I'm doing right now doesn't work is when you have a whole lot of polygons because you'll be clicking all day. So you may want to use something like the pen tool. Okay, so I have a nice selection which goes just outside my little zone there. That's perfect. So let's see here. Let's take my boot sole texture and we'll apply this as a layer mask. So boom, that crops that in very nicely. So if we test that out, Control-Alt-Shift-S, and I'll see if I can zip through this. Boom, save, replace, fly to Blender, and reload. Oh, we left our UVs on. That's okay. We don't have that bleed over on the underside of the shoe, but we did this kind of weird seam thing going on. You see, like how the texture runs right up to the edge? To me, that's problematic. I don't like that. So let's fix it. Let's go back over to Photoshop. This time I will turn off my UV layout because we don't need that anymore. And let's take a look at our boot sole again. So, bink, just blink that on and off for you so you can see what we're looking at. Let's take a look at the layer styles for this. What I'm going to do is make an inner glow, which is the color of the actual boot sole, and I'm going to use that as a way to blend this texture in, right? So let's do that. Inner glow. And by default, this is set to some whitish yellow color, which I don't like. We're going to sample whatever color the actual boot sole is, which is perfect. That's great. Then let's set our blend mode over to normal. Now, as you can see, we can just bring this in. Let's set opacity up to 100%. And this allows us the ability to control how far in we blend that. Now, if we set this over to precise, it might help, but I'm thinking I'm going to leave it at softer, and the reasons for that are a few, but we'll get there. Now you can choke this in to make sure you have a nice buffer zone around the inside of your UV layout, so you can see that. And let's just test this. Make sure we turn off UVs this time. Control-Alt-Shift-S once again. Save, boom, replace, fly over here, reload, and there we go. So now we're no longer going all the way in. I don't really mind what's going on here, but it does look a little bit too blended, so I'm going to do a few things. First off, let's take the overall opacity of this layer, and we're going to bleed it back a little bit, so it's not quite so pronounced. I just think it's going a little bit far. Next, let's go back into that layer style, and go back over to Inner Glow. And I kind of want to tighten this up, but there's something else I want to do too. To me, it would be nice if we had sort of a band around this texture. And, you know, at first you could be thinking, well, I could use a stroke, and I could set this to inside, and I could play with the size of it, and you'd be right. You could certainly do that. But a slightly cooler way to do it is to switch over to a gradient fill for our Inner Glow. Since we're using normal anyway, we can get away with this. Let's take our transparency, or our opacity stop. It's all in how you look at it, I suppose. And we'll push that all the way out for now. Excuse me. And I'll pull my first color flag in a ways. Actually, I'm going to hold down Alt and drag a copy of that out. So I have two of these color flags. Right in between them, I'm going to add a third flag that I'll just make a darker version. And you can already see what that did. It makes this nice little darkened path around the outside of our sole. Very cool. And if I bring out another one of these guys, you know, I could probably just get away with taking my opacity flags, and let's just leave them cranked all the way up. No, I can't do that. I can get close. So something about like so. And okay, that's starting to work. We don't have our exact color matched on the inside there, so I'm going to play with that for just a moment. Okay. And bring my smoothness down. Actually, the smoothness isn't going to matter at all. Alright, well, you now see that if I play with choke and size, I can control the positioning of that little area, which is very neat. So it's just kind of tweaking your values to find exactly where you want that to be. I don't really want to noise that up, but I mean I could. So I think we'll go with probably right about there. Yeah, we'll try that. So we'll click OK and do another save. Okay, looking good so far, and blink. So there we go. We get a nice circle around the outside of our soul. We get the texture inside. The next thing I want to do is break up this outer band. So I'd like to just put some regular bands that run down this in a vertical direction, kind of break it up like it was something like teeth. I mean, I don't want them to look like teeth, but that's the closest thing I can think of for a quick example. So let's zoom out a little bit, and let's see here. If I turn my UV layout back on, provided these guys are all laid out in a relatively uniform pattern, I'd like to think that if I made a bunch of uniformly spaced lines, that I would end up with exactly what I'm going for. With my kind of luck, though, that's probably exactly what I won't get. So let's see. Under the boots, what do I have going on here? We've got the upper area, which that's kind of a misnomer because that includes parts of the sole now. So let me see if I can start cleaning that up a little bit. We have boot sole color, boot sole text. Let's put that into its own little group, which we'll call the sole. Pull that out of that group. Well, out of that group, thank you. And then we can put the sole underneath the upper so that it blends kind of like it did a second ago. Actually, it looks like it was doing better off up above. So that's fine. And the grommets and the boot laces all seem like they would belong in the upper, so let's clean that up as well. Cool. So boots, we have sole, and we have upper, and that's all nice and clean. Next, let's go into the sole, and let's make a new solid color layer. Actually, wait a minute. We don't really need a solid color. Let's just make a new regular layer that I will call sole band text. I'm totally making that up as I go, by the way. And I'm going to grab my marquee selection tool and just drag out a little box. And I'm going to fill it with orange. Then, with that done, let's turn off our UVs for just a moment. Let's jump in here to our layer styles for this guy. We'll pull fill down to nothing. Let's do an inner glow of black with normal mode. And we'll increase the size a little bit. We'll bleed back the opacity just a tad. Boost the noise just a little to bust that up. And then, if I take a look at this, so Control-Alt-Shift-S, save, 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 replace, reload, okay, that pops up right there on the back. And it's not exactly perfectly straight, but it's a start. It is indeed a start. What I may end up having to do is get this in and then tweak out my UVs accordingly, which that's okay. I can do that. So now let's go back over to Photoshop, and I'm going to grab my marquee select tool. I'm going to select this guy and get the move tool. Now notice as soon as I try to move this that I grab just those pixels. So we're going to move this, but we're going to move it by holding the Alt key. Oh, also, let me make sure that my UV layout is visible so I can see what I'm doing. Now, check this out. If I overlap these squares, you see what that does to the texture. I don't want that. I've got to have a little bit of division in between them to make what I'm doing actually work. So we'll grab both of those, and you see they've got a little bit of a gap between them. Switch back over to Marquee Select and grab them both. Hold down V, and we'll move them both over. And we can also... I'm going to leave these guys in a straight line for now. I'm not going to worry about moving them up and down because I may end up, as I said, having to adjust those UVs. Let's now grab the next set and slide all those over so you can see how this kind of speeds up your process a little bit. Oh yeah, we can now grab all these because we still got a ways to go. Oh, close. And Control D, and Marquee Select, boom, V, move that over, and voila. So Control D, let's get out of here, let's turn off UVs, let's just see what that looks like all by itself. I have a feeling I'm going to have to make some adjustments to it, but that's cool. And reload. You know, for just kind of jumping straight out of the gate, that's not horrible. I would like it to appear a little more regular than it does, though, so I'm going to actually clean that up in the next video, or in an upcoming video. Maybe in the next video I'll actually kind of jump away. So that is going to wrap things up for this video. I do want to thank all of our viewers, and of course a big thank you goes out to our member sponsors who make everything we do possible, and I will catch you all on the next Blender vid. Greetings and welcome back. We are still texturing up our little banana man, boxer, dude, guy. And I want to get away from the boots for a while. I mean, they're starting to come along. There's still some things we could do to them, sure. But I think the bulk of the basics are done at this point, and we can tweak them out a little later. What I want to do now is shift over to the boxing gloves. I've just been kind of jonesing to get at those. So here's how we're going to do this. Let's go ahead and kind of focus up on what they look like, and then we'll jump over to Photoshop and have a look at our texture. We're going to do kind of the classic boxing glove look, so the outside will be red and the inside will be white. I'm trying to decide if I want to do laces. I mean, we've already seen how we can do laces. There's a couple of ways to approach that, and of course that's cool. But it seems like, you know, I was looking at reference material, and it seems like almost nobody does any sort of laces on their boxing gloves anymore. Now it's just Velcro straps. But, you know, that doesn't matter to us, really. That was just something I noticed. So let's turn our UV layout back on. And the way we're going to handle this is just by taking a look at how our panels are divided up. For starters, we can probably get away with just creating a white area in here. It will have to extend down the inside of the wrist to some degree, and we'll probably have to work on some seams to make those line up okay. That's fine. We can totally do that. Also, let's create a new group for the gloves. Oh, we already have a group for the gloves. Never mind what I just said. Let's expand that and start playing with that. So we have our base color. That's cool. Let's create a new solid color layer, and we'll make it white or something very close to it. Not quite white. And we're going to call this, what are we going to call this? Let's call this gloves secondary color. Now, we're already inside the gloves group, and you may be wondering, why does he even worry about writing gloves in there? It's for one reason and one reason alone. If I right-click on a layer with my move tool, if this list gets extremely deep, yes, I can still see that it's indented underneath gloves, but I don't have to focus on that. I can see a very concise name nice and quickly. It's just kind of it's a personal preference more than it is anything else. Let me pull some of that orange out of there. We'll keep it a nice clean white. Okie dokie. Now, we're going to flip the layer mask because we don't need that to be solid right now. So I did that with a Control-I, if you need to know. And let's see. I've got a stylus around here somewhere. Ah, here it is. Awesome. And let me grab my brush. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to scribble out a very freehand sort of inside shape. And I'll try to keep things nice and smooth. Oh, also, and I've mentioned this on probably other videos where I've been painting and scribbling with a stylus, and I'll try to mention it here as well. If you get into drawing with a tablet, remember to lift your pen from the surface every now and then, because nothing is quite as painful as messing something up and going, ooh, I better undo, and finding out that you undo a whole bunch of work. So it pays to do smallish strokes. Now, you can be too small. You can do, like, you know, just to make a line, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and like so on, and then that becomes really hard to undo if you need to. So it's one of those things you kind of have to get used to. find a workflow that works well for you and stick with it. Also remember, you can just erase lines. You don't necessarily have to reach for the undo key every single time either. And let's see, brush, make bigger, scribble, scribble, scribble. Yes, I could use things like the paintbrush, but it just seems so impersonal. Not the paintbrush, excuse me, the paint bucket. So we could hit like, what, G? Shift G, thank you. And fill that in, and then go back to our brush. There you go. Ta-da! Okay, now let's turn off our UV layout, and let's just see where that's placed in terms of the model. Boom, save, replace. And reload. Oh, look at that. Actually, that's going to work out really well. I think that'll be perfect. We do need to run it down the wrist, as I mentioned earlier, and we can, of course, do that. But overall, I think that's going to be a great start for how this all should go down. So, let's jump back over to Photoshop, and let's take a look at how that's going to need to run down the wrist. Now, if I turn my UVs back on, it looks to me like we can just paint right down through here. I'll try to smooth that out as best I can, and then back through here. Again, trying to smooth out. Now, here's the trick. This looks like is what's going to wrap underneath to a significant degree, and that's 1, 2, 3 edges, and here we have 1, 2, and then 3 there. So let's just try this. Let's see, if I just make a little swath here, and scribble that in, and then I'm totally guessing, by the way, whether for good or for evil, and scribble, 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 scribble. Alright, and we'll push that out just a little bit further for safety's sake, and right there at that corner as well, and up here as well. Goodness gracious. Alright, and we'll turn off UV layout, Control-Alt-Shift-S, do the save thing, save, 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 jump over, and reload. Ooh, that's so close. Look how close that is. Be amazed at the closeness. That's actually not bad. I'm kind of impressed with myself. Okay, sweetness. And I mean, I could tweak UVs a little bit to make that pretty much dead on, but like from just about any gaming viewing angle, that's close enough for government work. It's certainly close enough for a demonstration, so I'm happy. Let's jump back over to Photoshop though, and let's see. The next thing I want to do is give that a little more character. So let's do that by putting some layer style shading on it. Now again, I'm just reminding everybody, although I probably don't need to at this point, that I like using these layer styles as a starter. In terms of what we're doing, I think they're a great way to get a quick result that everybody can kind of follow along with. Everybody using Photoshop anyway. If you're not using Photoshop and you don't have a program that has something like, you know, a layer style, then I'm sorry. Truly. Something we could try. We could try this. We could try filling this in with a dark red color as opposed to a true black. And the neat thing about doing that is it's kind of suggestive of a little bit of color bleeding, like there's red light bouncing onto the inside of the glove. We can noise that up just a little bit. And we could do an outer glow as well. Now this really could be black with a blend mode of normal and a low opacity. And we can spread that out a little bit with some noise as well. And really low opacity, so bring that down. Then we could do a stroke on top of that with a really, let's put that on the center, 2 pixels. Ooh. Something great, just kind of a nice thing about using stroke like this is it does let you see where you've got any problems from when you were scribbling. So what we'll do is we'll leave that on, and we'll use that as a way to attack problems. So let's get our brush out. Oh, you know, just read my mind, Photoshop. So there, that's where I want to paint. I had to make sure I had my layer mask selected, by the way. So now we just look for these funny little black spots and just paint them out. Because what those are holes in our layer where we don't have full opacity, and it's leading to problems with our layer styles. And that's always good to know. so that you can tackle that. Scribble, scribble. Scribble, scribble. Scribble, scribble, scribble. I think that got it. Anything else? Zoom! Yep. And fill. Zoom, pull back. Okay, now, back to work. Let's grab this guy, come over here to stroke. Center's good, but let's go to like, well, 1 pixel might actually do it because we've got such softening there. And then instead of black, let's use like a really nice dark red. It's just kind of bringing out that seam a little bit. We might even, and this will be weird if it works, but we could just take a stab at it. We could try, let's see, luminosity. No, it's not going to do what I want. Multiply with a pattern. And that creates little irregularities, like it's, something more like stitching, where it's kind of bunched up here and there. We could try any one of these other textures as well. That's not bad. That kind of breaks things up nicely. Or this, just kind of random noise. And we can adjust the scale to find something that we like. Totally cheating. Totally cheating. Yeah, let's just go with that for a minute. And I'm going to take my outer glow and boost it a little more. In fact, let's spread it just a notch. And take our inner glow, and we'll choke it. And size it up just a little bit. Now let's see what that looks like. So, it may look like, well, it may look terrible, but I want to see. I'm curious. So jump over, reload. Yeah, it kind of does look terrible. But it's a start. It's just too bright. So I need to darken it up. So let's go back over to the stroke. And color of multiply probably isn't going to hack it. Opacity can be all the way up at max. It's just that's just not going to go. It's not going to go. It's just not going to go. So we could just do a regular color. Keep it simple. Here there is something we could try. I don't know how well this will work, but it's one of those things you never know until you do try. We could do a gradient, and we can set this to shape burst. And yeah, if this does work, I'll be kind of intrigued because I've never tried this before. Take the opacity here and make it 0. Take the opacity here and make it 0. Take the opacity in the center and make it 100%. Ooh. And then we'll do black in the middle. Actually, we just do black all around. What am I saying? So everything just be black. Just black. Nothing but black. And we're fading it out on either side. We could pinch it in quite a ways. Yeah, that's too much pinching. Too much pinching! Okay, so if I use that, and let's see, if I switch away from that, do I lose that? No, I don't. Well, that's cool. So we can color, and then compare it against the gradient, and it just softens it a little. Okay, it didn't have the tremendous result that I hoped it would, but let's just see what that looks like. So save, replace, jump over, reload. And it looks a lot better. We are creating a funny little seam right over here, and the reason we're creating that seam seems to be with our inner glow. So the way I would fix that, since we have all this dead texture space up here, is just to get my paintbrush out, make sure I'm on the glove secondary layer, and just spread this a little bit more. So that layer style can really kind of smear out there and get a little bit further, you see. So it starts actually shifting over to white. Because in the end, what we need is for that to hit white or close to it by the time we make it to the actual seam. That's the ideal scenario. So let's take a look at that inner glow, and we'll maybe adjust that a little bit so it doesn't go out quite as far. So we're a little more guaranteed to hit white before we hit those seams. Click OK. We can do the same thing here. Yeah. Again, Photoshop, I need you to read my mind, really. If you can do that, that'd be great. So we'll just get that away from the seam, get that away from the seam. We're bleeding over onto the body, which is a little bit scary. But we don't have to be too frightened by that, and here's why. We can grab the glove's base color, and I just control-clicked on that layer mask. We can take the gloves layer, and we can make a layer mask for that. And you see how that just constrained everything. So we're basically saying no pixels that affect the gloves should ever go out past the extent of the gloves themselves, which is just a smart way to work anyhow. And bleed that out a little bit. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. Control-Alt-Shift-S. Save, save, hit the buttons over and over. Reload. Oh yeah. Still a little wonky here, but a whole lot better than it was. What I can do is we're meeting up pretty well right there, but I can bring this up a little higher, and that should help. And that should be over here. So just kind of grab this guy, make my brush a little smaller, and make that kind of a nice straight line straight back to there. And let's just see how that looks. Okay, quick save. Reload, and that cleaned that up quite a bit. Yes, we can see our UVs, but we're not going to stress that too much right now. We got a little bit of a funny little seam right there at the corner, but right this minute, not anything to freak out about. So I think that's a really good start on our boxing gloves. Of course, there's a lot more detailing that we can do to them, but we will tackle that kind of as we go. That will, however, wrap things up for this video, so I want to thank all of our viewers, especially our member sponsors, without whom we would be completely lost. And I will catch you all on the next video. Thanks a lot. Greetings and welcome back. Let's get back to work on our character's boxing gloves. So I'm going to do a couple of adjustments to where some of these painted seams wind up. We've also got a little bit of seamage starting to get visible here, so we can't let our outer glow go out too far, obviously. We can see why. So let's take a look at that, and we'll start off here by just adjusting that outer glow color just a little bit, or adjusting how far out it goes, really. That's the big thing. So we'll pull the size down, keep this kind of tight, like so. Click OK. Another thing I wanted to do was make this whole thing kind of go up the inside of the wrist a little more. So here I am on the glove's secondary color layer, and I'm going to paint this to kind of wrap up the inside of the wrist a little further, like so. And we'll just paint that right out to the edge. Now let's give this a quick test. So Control-Alt-Shift-S. Now you'll notice I've left my UVs on for testing something that's really not that big of a deal. So we'll just kind of roll with it. And there we go. So that pulls away some of the seam problems we're seeing up there, and now the white part of the gloves extends out a little more, which is what I want. I still am interested in coming up with a little lace design that can be stuck in there. So let's go ahead and tackle that next. Now we've already seen a way to go about doing something like laces, so I'm going to try to keep this pretty quick, because these aren't going to be as detailed as the boot laces anyway. However, they do warrant their own group. That's a layer, not a group. So let's throw that away, drop in a group, and we'll call this, I'll call this put folks in the right area, and we'll call this gloves, laces. And let's see, let's drop a regular layer in there, and we'll call this, I'll just call it seam for now, or hang on, laces seam, so I can see what it is. And currently we're painting orange again, and that's alright. We're just going to do a nice big stripe of orange that does something like this. And I'm going to test where that is. Let's turn off the UV layout, Control-Alt-Shift-S, save, U, replace, jump over, reload. And that's not too bad. I mean, I could bring it down so it angled a little more, but a little bit of twisting to it isn't really the end of my whole planet. But let's just see here. If I do something more like this, See if that helps a little bit. Alright. Boom. Control-Shift-S. Save. Yes. Stuff. Jump over. And reload. That's a little better. It looks a little bit distorted, and that concerns me just because of what the laces may end up looking like, but that's okay. We can tweak out the UVs when we're done and make it look pretty. So no worries. Let's take the laces seam and drop on some layer styling. So we'll turn off fill opacity. We'll do an inner glow, and we'll make that black, and we'll set it to normal. Click OK, and let me go ahead and paint this way out through there. That'll be nice. Let's jump back over into our inner glow settings, and we'll noise that up a little bit. We'll extend that out just a little as well. We could do a color overlay, and red is actually not a horrible color for that, but we're just going to kind of darken it up, and the color we end up with is not as important. Outer glow for some shading, so again, black, normal, increase size, play with noise. Okay, that's looking pretty snazzy, I think. So let's test that. Let's test this out. Save, grab, replace, jump over, reload. Oh yeah, that could totally work. We probably will see a little bit of distortion that we may have to clean up by tugging around some UVs, but that's all right. Again, I stress that I'm okay with that. Okay, now on top of this, we need some laces. I'm not going to stress too much about things like the grommets like I did before. So let's just put on a laces layer. So laces, or hang on, glove laces 1. So that's nice. And I will make that a solid color layer. So boom, solid color, fantastic. And for now, we'll just make a bright, obnoxious green. We'll invert that so we don't actually see anything. And let's get our paintbrush and make it nice and small, because we can't have these being too big. And boom. There's one lace. And then this guy can go here. Hang on. I'm already doing it wrong. That's why it's so nice to have grommets, because now I'm doing it off the top of my head. Let's do from inside to out here, then from inside to out here, from inside to out here, from inside to out here, inside, out here, and out there. Okay, cool. So, I might have been better off. You know what? Okay, so I'm not going to do grommets. If you want to giggle, get it out of your system now. Instead, though, I'm going to create some dots just to work like guides, because just trying to freehand that, I'm just not pleased with what I got. So we'll call this glove grommet, and it might help to use later. So let me hit D, and that'll allow me to paint black, make my brush just a little bit smaller, and boom. We'll just do some little tiny dark dots down the inside of the gloves. Cool. Now we can switch over to glove laces 1 and go back to painting on some strings. Cool. We go from inside to here, from inside to here. And we'll do a couple of strokes over that to make sure it stays nice and thick and obvious. From inside to up here. Yeah, this is going to look a lot better. Inside to out here. Okay. And we will just create a new solid color, which green worked for one. We'll do blue on this one. Invert the layer mask, copy the name, this will be glove laces 2, and same as before. We're just doing some more painting, so this time we'll go from inside out to here, and then out to there, and out to there, and out to there. Cool. So now let's make sure those end up as the same color. Let's try red laces, just for fun of it. So pick a nice shade of red. Oh, and grab the hex code for it, just so that you can copy-paste the color very quickly, which is nice. Then let's do a couple of layer styles. So we'll do an outer glow for a shadow effect. Black, normal, keep it nice and tight, play with opacity. We can do a drop shadow, which we can pull back just a little bit. Again, keep the size nice and tight. So somewhere right about there. Take the size a little more. Play with opacity. Looking good. And we could do a bevel and emboss. It does leave kind of an interesting result on how those look. Adds to just kind of a cheap sense of realism. I would pull down the opacity of the highlight, though, so they don't look quite so shiny. Click OK, and then we can copy-paste that on top of the other laces as well, so you get a nice kind of depth look. Now, for the gloves, we can do another black outer glow. You notice I really like that, because it's kind of a almost like an ambient occlusion cheat in a really nasty sort of way. Actually, and we can pull the opacity back, noise those up a little. And it almost starts to give the look that there's some wrinkling going on there, which I kind of like. Play with the noise just a little bit. Okay, let's save and do a quick test. Save. Replace. And reload. Oh, nice. I likey. Zacky likey. I don't like that little seam there, but I may have to just kind of live with that. Okay, so let's see, a couple of other things that I can do between now and the end of Yawn video. I'd like to create a nice band of... Ooh, the lace even goes on the inside. It almost looks like the lace does reflect, which that's interesting. I'll just go with it. It's funny. Meaning like you can actually see through to the inside of the laces. I sort of dig that. Let's do a couple of things, though. Let's do some darkening around the inside where the glove ends, so it's like it kind of recesses back into darkness. And I'd like to do a white band around the inside of the glove. So we can start there. Actually, hang tight. Thinking. Yeah, bear with me just a half second. Let me blink my strings real quick, because I just want to do a couple of quick tweaks to these guys. Okay, make sure that I'm painting where I need to. Okay, and thicken you up a little bit, and thicken you up a little bit. Okay, sorry, I just want to kind of go back over these laces real quick and make sure that they're nice. Ooh, there we go. Make sure you're painting on the right one. Okay, so that's cool. Alright, so to create some darkening around the inside, we do have to be a little bit careful in doing this. Let's turn on our UVs. We can cheat, though. An interesting way to cheat is to... Let's do this. Let's create a new layer. Solid color's fine. We're going to make it black, and we're going to call this glove inside shadow, so we know exactly what that's for. Let's invert its layer mask so it's non-existent. Then, if we don't want there to be a seam, we can just use our polygonal lasso and trace right down. Well, actually, here's the funny thing. We don't really have to trace while we're inside the shape of the glove itself. We can make this nice and curvilinear just by clicking a whole bunch of times, make something that flows really well. But then when we get out here to the outside, just make sure that we end right there on that same polygonal edge. So now we can just wrap this around. It doesn't matter where it goes because it's all constrained anyway. Fill that in with white. Control D. And then if we turn this off, and let's hit Control Shift S, just as a test. That's all we're doing right now is testing. replace, Control Tab, reload. And now if we look inside, we've got a nice, relatively seamless, there's a tiny bit of a seam there, but I'm not going to stress that right now, shadow. Now it's a little bit too pronounced for what I have in mind, but it's a good start. Such a good start, too, that that's where we're actually going to leave this video. So with that, I want to thank all of our viewers, especially our member sponsors. You guys make everything we do possible, and we appreciate you so very much. And I will see you all in the next video. Thanks a lot. Okay, we're back, and in this video we're going to continue on creating some more texturing for the gloves. In the last video we created this really dark and obnoxious looking shadow on the inside of our gloves, which is a great place to start, but not where we necessarily want everything to end. So let's take a look at cleaning that up a little bit and making it look a little nicer. So we can do that in a couple of different ways. What I'd like to do, if you'll bear with me for just a second while I kind of dwell on this. Yeah, let me try something. I got an idea about something that I think should work pretty well. Yeah. Okay, sorry, I had to stop and think. I'd like to see this fade away nice and cleanly from the inside to the outside, and that's not always a very easy thing to do. So let's try something. Let's do a trick. I'm actually going to put this guy away for just a second. Make him go away. Let's turn on our UVs for a moment. Let's make a new layer. This is all such a crazy test. I'm just really hoping it works. Let's call this Glove Inside Shadow Test, because I don't know how this is going to respond. And let's grab something like our line tool. 1 pixel's nice, probably 2 or 3 pixels will be better. And let's trace out a little line that goes right. Oh, are we doing shapes? Oh, God. I don't want to do shapes. Let's just do pixels. And of course I did that by clicking on the raster fill pixels button up here at the top in my options, and then I'm carefully, you notice I'm very carefully tracing down the pixels that border my UV layout. Okay. And we'll fill that in just a little more thickly. Okay, let's turn off our UVs. Control-Alt-Shift-S. I just want to see where this ends up. Ink, replace, and jump over here, and reload. Okay, and we get this tight little black line, a little bit of a seaming issue, not much of one. Let's see if we can just kind of fill that in and make it happier. So let's see, if I jump back, that seam is just on the far side of the strings. That's good to know, by the way. So it should put it right here on this end. So we'll just thicken that up a little bit. And we'll do an immediate test. Control-Alt-Shift-S. Save. U. And I mean, I don't need to spend too much time with this because, again, I can always tweak the UVs. But that pushed that out a little bit. And that lines up much more nicely now. Okay, cool. Now, with that done, now let's play with our various settings. We could do an outer glow of black. Let's do a normal black. And we can really just size the heck out of that thing. Big spread. See Photoshop kind of fighting me over that whole thing. That's pretty nice. Let's see. Let's just see how that looks. It may not... Ooh, let's set our technique to precise. Oh, yeah, that's going to help a lot, actually. And we can noise it up just a teensy bit. Don't go too much. So just a little bit of noise so it's not quite so perfect. Click OK. Control-Alt-Shift-S. Save. Jump in. Replace. Here, reload. Oh, look at that. Nice darkening on the inside of the glove. I dig it. The only thing I might do is Let's see. Let's take my inner glow, or I'm sorry, outer glow. Pardon me. And I like what's going on, but I think I'm just going to bleed the opacity down a little. Let me see if I can do a kind of a layering effect here. This will either work or it'll fail miserably. So, well, he said, Yeah, let me try something else instead. Let me grab this guy, and if I pull this back, do we get anything? Anything at all? No. Yeah, I thought that would. Okay. Yeah, let me try this layering trick that I want to play with, see if this will work. So if I pull the opacity on this guy down temporarily, so it's just making some general shadowing here. Now we put a stroke on this guy. Make the stroke nice and big. Then set the stroke to gradient with a gradient style of shape burst. Then take the gradient and make the second flag transparent. Okay, that's not going to do what I wanted it to. Wait. Yeah, it is. Just in the wrong direction. Well, that's most excellent. Not really. Okay, so it's replacing. Okay, well, one had to try, right? So if we take this, make this guy opaque, but make him black, it would work, except that we've got, let me see, playing with a blend mode help? No, because it's replacing those pixels, so we get this funny band where everything sort of disappears. We can't layer using a stroke. That would be a neat trick, and I've never tried that before, but no, it's not going to do what I want it to. Yeah, I think that'll work. One thing we can do, if we like this kind of soft look going out, we can just layer a couple of these. So we can make this guy spread way out, kind of like so, and click OK, and then we can duplicate him, jump into this guy, and make his settings very tight, and sort of blend in between the two, set his opacity all the way up. So we just kind of go from stage 1 to stage 2. And I'm going to jump back down here and adjust the blending in between the two through this guy. Just watch out for banding. See, he's going to ride it right to that edge. So let's test that. Control-Shift-S, save, jump over, replace, jump in, reload. Yeah, there's some nice darkening going into the glove there. Okay, so that's cool. It is kind of creeping out a little bit far, and that's just one of those things that we had to test to know for sure. So we want to keep it within this little band here. This is where everything's all close together. So let's grab our first inside shadow, which we're not going to be calling that test for much longer, it looks like. We can pull that in, click OK, turn our UVs back on, and that'll probably work. So Control-Alt-Shift-S, save, test, replace, reload. There we go. Yeah, so we have some nice shading going on inside the glove. Now, something else we can do while we are here, since we're just kind of staring right at it, is we can jump over to the arm, which should be this great big long piece of geometry here, and we can take the, let's change the name of these, Gloves Inside Shadow Primary, and Gloves Inside Shadow Secondary. We can take both of them, but let's just start with primary only. And we can grab our line tool again, and we can paint this. Well, yeah, this will work. Okay, yeah, bear with me. We can paint that, but we've got to open up a hole in our layer mask over here. So let's do that first. I'll just select somewhere over here, fill this in with white so we can see. That's great. So fill that in, Control-D, and ooh, this may not work as well as I want it to. I don't know, let me try it before I knock it. But I'm thinking now it won't work. What I was going to try to do is just reuse my shadow area over here on the end of the arm, but I already don't like where it's going. So I'm going to just nuke that, undo. We don't want to do that. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. All right, so let's make sure this guy does end up getting named secondary because I undid a little too far back. And we're happy. Okay, the next thing I'd like to do is create a band of white right around the outer edge of the glove, being right out here. Just kind of break things up a little bit. So to do that, I'm going to try to avoid seaming altogether, make that a non-issue, by just connecting here on the inside. So I have this glove's secondary color. If I sneak right underneath that and create a new solid color, not a mask, just create a new solid color that I'm going to name, well, it can have any color that it wants for now. We're going to name this glove trim. It's not something we're going to be using very much. Let's set it to whatever shade of white we're using in here, or something at least relatively close to it. We're going to invert our layer mask, or try to invert our layer mask. Thank you. Goodbye. And then let's just paint this in. Now, I set my stylus down. There it is. It's kind of dark in my room right now. Let's just paint right along this little path, like so. Okay. And go ahead and get my eraser out. And actually, I don't need my eraser. Let's just hit X and clean that up a little bit. Okay, turn off the UVs and let's test that. Save, do stuff, save, replace, go to Blender, reload. Ink. Cool. Now we can give that some more character the way we've been giving everything else character. We can do a little bit of an inner glow. Let's do a little more red as well, because that was a really cool idea and it's working really well for us. And put a little more red in there. Darker, and pull the size way down. That'll work. Let's do outer glow, and again, this can just be black, normal. Bring the opacity way down for that. Increase the size very slightly. Kick up the noise very slightly. I do want to see what a stroke's going to do if set to the outside at like 1 pixel. It's just too choppy because it's a painted thing, so that's okay. At least we tried. We could apply a bevel and emboss, and then adjust our settings, turn off the global light, and just shine it that way. So it just gives it a little more of a 3D depth-like effect. Also, something we can do is, and this should look pretty cool, and we're going to do it to the outside anyway, but we can go ahead and just start on the inside, is we can put on, now we've got our glove trim, and that should look pretty good. I'm not even going to worry about that. Let's put on another layer, which I'll call Glove Inside Shadow Detail. I'm going to put my layer effects on that. So I just copied the layer effect from my shadow primary, and I have black paint right now, and make a really tiny little brush. And I'm going to make a couple of strokes that radiate outward, and the first thing I'm going to do is bring those settings way, 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 way down. So that outer glow, which was huge, is now suddenly going to be nowhere near as huge. Okay, and now I can just paint little wrinkles that kind of come out from the inside of the glove, like so. So it looks like it kind of bunches up a little in there, and I'm going to erase that guy out a little and just keep that a little further back. Okay, let's see how this looks. So Control-Alt-Shift-S, save, jump in, replace, and reload. Yeah, there you go. Got some bunching up, got a little bit of detail there on the outer edge of the boxing glove. I think this is a pretty good place to call the video for now. things are really starting to shape up, and I just wanted to thank all of our viewers for watching, and again, a huge thank you to all of our member sponsors for making 3D Buzz a place for you to get your 3D education. And with that, I hope to see you on the next Blender video. Take care. Alright, we're back, and we're still doing some texturing of the glove area. In the last video, we did some cleanup of the little black band around the hands and some other things as well. What I want to do here, if I switch over to Blender, I can actually point it out to you, it might be a little easier. I want to take a look at adding some detail to the underside of the glove, kind of like some false shadowing, some wrinkles, that sort of thing, just to make it look a bit more realistic. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to jump back over to Photoshop, and I'm already inside the glove group, which is good. Let's go ahead and create a new... I thought about just doing a blank layer, but I'm going to start with a solid color layer. I can always rasterize it later if I feel like it, and we'll start off by making this black. We'll invert the layer mask, as always, and I'm going to zoom in here to this white spot and get my brush out. Now my brush is pretty big right now. Now, I am using my stylus for this at the moment. So, if you're seeing like some of these scratchy little streaks I'm coming up with and you're wondering why the strokes that you make don't look like that, well, it could be because you're using your mouse again, which I'm not. Now, these are getting kind of a hand-drawn look at first. Generally, I'm okay with that, at least for the moment. But I'm going to do a few things. Let's go over to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I don't want to blast them into nowhere. But just a little bit, like so. And then kind of go back over it. Add in a few more wrinkles. Now, let's take the color of all this, and we'll pull it from black to sort of a gray, and I just want to test and see what this ends up looking like. So, do a quick save out, like we've done many times before. Jump back over to Blender and reload. And that's not half bad. I could put a few more a little further up where they kind of get underneath the knuckles. So let's take a look at doing that. So get back over here and brush some stuff on in here. Now, for some localized blurring, I can actually grab the blur tool. Alright, and once again, just a real quick save, transfer over to Blender, and reload! And I think that'll work for now. I am trying to keep this relatively simple, at least for this first go-around. Okay, so let's move away from the gloves for a while. I'd like to start on some texturing for the body. I think that'd be a cool place to move over to. So, let's see here. If I jump back over to Photoshop, where shall we begin? There's all kinds of different ways we could begin this. I think what I'd like to do is create kind of an offset color so that he wasn't this one consistent uniform color across his body. It'd be nice to have some variation. There's a couple of different ways we can do that. The way I'm going to go about it, also just, you just watched me paint those wrinkles. If you're feeling up for it, it would probably be cool to do some similar wrinkles around the boots. I'm just not going to do it right now. I just thought I'd mention that. Okay, so the body. Right now, we've got this cool shade of yellow that is on its own little layer, so we can change that to anything we want. What I want to do is paint some kind of highlight areas on the flat parts of the banana's body. So there's a couple of different ways we can do that. One way that I've used in the past, if I know, let me make sure I get one sentence out at a time. If I know I need something that's going to be a little bit fuzzy, and I need to define it and maybe adjust the amount of fuzziness later on, I will do a couple of tricks involving layer styles, but, well, I'll show you how it works, and then whether or not we keep it, I don't know. This is one of those kind of over-the-shoulder things, so if nothing else, you'll learn a trick out of it. Let's go ahead and create a solid color layer so I can match the colors later on if I need to. I'm going to make this a super bright shade of yellow, and I will immediately invert the layer mask. Now, what I'm going to do is get my paintbrush out, and let's paint... Actually, I don't want any blurring, so let's use the pencil tool for this. You'll see why very shortly. And I'm just going to paint a stroke straight down the middle of the body. Like so. About as simple as it gets. Now, inside the color here, I'm going to grab the hex code for that, which is FFF000. Easy to remember. Now, let's go to our layer styles. I'm going to do an outer glow and set this to the same color and switch this from screen to normal and set the opacity to 100%. And see, I can blur that out. Now, I will need to set this to precise for that kind of an effect. And see, in this way, I can create an effect where I can control how much blurring is taking place. I'm not sure I really want to use this technique in this case, but I have used it in the past, and I did kind of want to at least show you how it works. We can also do a few more things, like we can temporarily turn it off, and then we can get our eraser out, and we can start kind of chiseling away at the sides here. So bring that down to a point, and you see how that kind of starts to thin things out down there at the bottom. Also, just for the sake of handling this, let me take my outer glow, and I'll temporarily turn it down. And in doing that, I can now come in and erase away the corners and start kind of pinching that in. I can also switch back over to my brush, and I can widen things out. And you can also, and I don't know how well this is going to work, but I'm going to try it anyway. Let's just try a quick Gaussian blur on that. Yeah, it's just kind of puffing it all out a little bit. What I'm doing, what I'm actually aiming for, is to get some nice bright yellow on the flat spots of the banana so that this underlayer that we have shows up more at the corners. Again, as I've already kind of mentioned, there's a lot of ways to go about handling something like this. And you can just hand paint the whole thing and not worry about any funny little tricks with layer styles and that sort of thing. What I'm doing right now is I'm using the smudge tool to kind of stretch out that stripe that I painted. And see, that just takes everything and pushes it a little bit further out. So now let's grab the brush, and I'll make my brush kind of small. And let's just trace right along. In fact, you know what? I'm going to pull my glow in just a little so it doesn't go out quite so far. So maybe something like that. And maybe I'll just hit it with another Gaussian blur here in a minute. And let's just trace very carefully along there. Now I'm going to trace on the far outside of the body. So I'm getting all along that seam, and then I'm going to need to do the same thing on the other side, so keep that in mind. And let's see, do we have... Okay, good. We're not affecting the gloves, even though it kind of looked for a second like we were. Okay, now let's do a couple of things. I still don't know if I'm really sold on this. Here's what our mask looks like, by the way. Very kind of chunky. Let's do a blur on that. Kind of evens everything out just a little. Click OK. I'm going to take my body base layer mask, and I'm going to copy that up to the body group, so that'll chop that effect off, so I know it's not bleeding out anywhere it doesn't need to be. We can turn off our UV layout for just a moment. It looks like okay, well, I've got a hole there where the arm comes in, but that'll be alright. That shouldn't really affect anything. But, let's see. I will need to worry about where this joins in with the arm, and there's a couple of ways I'll probably want to go about at least looking into that. Let's just see what this looks like in 3D before I go much further. I'm not yet sold on this, but I gotta give it a try. Alright. And let's see here. Boom. And just cycle that back around. And it is giving us a nice effect at the corners. Of course, we can now see the seams for the arms, and I imagine we can see similar seams for the legs. And we'll need to take care of that, of course, but that should be alright, really. Okay, well, let's just go with it for now, and we'll just start cleaning up the remaining areas. So let's jump back over to Photoshop. And what I'll do is turn my UVs back on, and we'll just paint right around the base of the arm and the base of the leg. Now we have to be a little bit careful here at the base of the leg. Because, and you'll see why, as soon as I start painting, you'll see that it bleeds over onto the arm, so we have to be a little bit restrictive in how this pans out. The way I'm going to solve that is, I'm actually going to undo that stroke so we're not actually painting anything. We're going to do a special layer, a special copy of this layer actually, and we're going to call this leg correction. So it's its own thing, and we're going to clear out its layer, oh, that's layer style, it's a layer mask, so we'll just wipe all that out, purely to black, and what we can do is paint right along in here and do the same thing. Now it's still bleeding onto the arm, as you can see, but we can do something kind of fancy here. We can get the polygonal lasso tool. Let me deselect real quick, and let's just make a quick trashy selection that goes around this one little area. Okay, and we'll drop that into its own group, and we will make a layer mask around that group. And it looks like I've got a, what's that, team viewer window popping up in the way? Alright, right there on that group we go ahead and click, and that should make a layer mask, which as you can see constrains the effect strictly to the leg. It doesn't bleed over onto the arm, which is all I wanted to avoid. So let's name the group leg highlight fix. Now, later on, once we determine that this is exactly the color that we want to use, it'd probably be a good idea to just rasterize this all down so it can all be on one layer. But for now, this will work. The cool thing about still having it this way, though, is that we can still go back and we can change some things. Like we can make, if we want, green at the corners or something greener, we can do that. I still kind of like the orangish color. I want it to be fairly subtle. I don't want to push it too far. In fact, it might be a little bit too pronounced as it is, but we'll kind of take a look at that as we go. So now let's test this out. Control-Alt-Shift-S. Thank you. What I was trying to get at. Save. Jump back over. And jump over to Blender. And reload. And, see, now we have one thing going on. We've got our nice bright highlights around the edge of the arm. That's good in its own way. It still looks a little funny. But now we need nice bright highlights around the edge of those holes as well so that everything matches up. So let's go back over to Photoshop, and we'll jump back over now to our body layer. And let's turn our UV layout back on. Zoom in over here. And let's get our brush, make sure I'm on the proper layer. We're not worried about the leg correction right now. We're just painting on this guy, and I'm just going to paint around that. Now, things do look funny. Remember that earlier we took that outer glow, which is creating a lot of that fuzziness, and we pulled down its opacity. So that is going to cause things to look a little wonky at the moment. We'll be fixing that. Make sure we get this little line there. And scribble around the edge of this hole as well. And let's go ahead and fix that problem with the layer styles. So we'll jump into the outer glow and take its opacity, crank it up to 100%, and then I'm just going to alt-click and drag that over to the leg fix as well. Turn off the V's. Control-Alt-Shift-S. Save, bam, replace, and then over inside of Blender, reload, and there we go.
So at least they're the same color when they line up now, so we're not getting those harsh contrasts in color. Now, all we've really done is we've created a main color, a main base color for the body of the banana, and then at the corners we're just getting a little bit of variation. And I'm not even, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not even sure that I like the degree of variation at the moment. So we're going to change the name here. This will no longer be body base. This will be body variation. We're going to take the leg highlight area and this guy, we're going to put them into a group, which we'll call base color. So if we need to change that, we have to dive into that group. That's okay. Let's get something that's a little bit close. We'll start by grabbing the actual yellow color that we're using, and we'll start offsetting from there. So we can push this down to a little bit of orange. Not that much orange. So something right about there. Extremely subtle. Let's just test that out real quick. So save, replace, jump over to Blender, reload. So it can still be felt. You can still feel that difference at the corners, but it's nowhere near as pronounced. So that puts us at about 15 minutes in. We've got a good start on a much more defined base for the body of the character. We've cleaned up the gloves a little bit. I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap the video there. I do want to thank everybody for following along. Also a huge thank you to all of our 3D Buzz member sponsors, and I'll catch you all on the next video. Welcome back as we continue our texturing process. Now we left off adding just a little bit of flavor to the banana's body with these kind of long stripes of varying colors. What I want to do now is add a little more interesting areas to the body. We're going to take the tip at the top and bottom and we're going to darken those up and make them just a little bit more visually interesting. First, let's go ahead and turn on our UVs so we can see kind of what's going on. And then I'm going to zoom in a bit, and let's do it like this. I'm going to create a new folder underneath the body, a new group, and we're going to call this end. That's good enough. Let's grab a solid color layer, which will make some shade of brown, kind of a warmer shade, I think. Then we'll do the same standard. We'll go ahead and invert the layer mask. Let me get my brush out. And I'm just going to color this in for now. Now, currently I'm using the pencil tool. It doesn't really matter because I'm going all the way over the borders, and I'm just filling all of this in. I could use the paint bucket and probably save myself about, I don't know, 8 seconds worth of scribbling here, but somehow I find the scribbling satisfying. And we'll color this around as well. Same thing. Okay, now of course that's just a start. Now let's switch over to the actual paintbrush tool. And what I'm going to do is paint a stripe right across the top of our banana, letting that blend kind of do its thing with the hardness of the brush. Now I don't expect that to line up perfectly, but with any luck, it'll get reasonably close. Do the same thing down here, and I'll go over the inside just one more time because it looked like I got a little bit close to the border. Now, let's turn off our UVs and let's do a quick test, see how this is working. Replace. And we'll jump back over to Blender and test. And we've got a nice little brown tip there, which seems to fade off pretty well. Little bit of a seam issue there, though not a super bright one. We do get a little bit of coloration issues right in there, so it'll be important to be aware of that. We can fix that. And a little bit of the same back here, so I'd want to clean those up as well, but overall, that seam isn't horrible. I have seen worse. Alright, let's get back over to Photoshop. And some of that we can go ahead and clean up now as I jump around. Let me hit F so I can just pull the document around a little bit. And we'll scribble all that in to be completely brown. Let's turn on our UVs. Same thing over here, just in case there's any blurring or blending as to where those borders take place. That'll just be safer. Now, I'm going to jump back down to our base color, which was this nice yellow. And let me get my brush out, make sure we're painting on this layer. And I'm just going to fill this in along the stem on either side so we don't have any problems with the seam right there. And then down here on the bottom, I'm going to do the same thing, because it looked like we had a little bit of a misunderstanding as to where that effect should end. So that should take care of that, or at least hide it a little better than it was. Now back over here to the ends. Just for my sake, I'm going to go ahead and fill the rest of this in with this brown color, for no other reason than it makes me happy. Okay, now a couple of other things. Let's make the tips of these ends look a little more interesting. Give them just something cooler to look at. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to create a selection just around the inside. In fact, I don't even need to use this guy. Let me do it like so. Let me do just a regular lasso, and I'll switch over to my pen, and I'm just going to draw something about like so. I'll come up here, and I'll do something very similar. Okay, and we'll go to Select, Modify, and Feather. 5 pixels sounds good. 10 pixels sounds better. Now let's just see what happens. If I was to create a solid color, we get that sort of faded effect, which is exactly what I'm going for. So I'm going to cancel that. And instead of a solid color effect, which I was just using as a test, we'll drop down a pattern. Now one of the default patterns in Photoshop is this funny, nasty, bubbly effect, which I generally hate, just to be honest. But we've got all kinds of others that we can bring in. We've got nature patterns, all kinds of random, like rock patterns and whatnot. It almost doesn't matter which ones we use. Let's see what... the nature patterns looks a little funny there. The leaves are a little too obvious. That could probably work. Not necessarily the color. I'm really not interested in the color. I just need something that'll chunk this up a little bit. To be fair, even this original wouldn't work, but I just don't like seeing those bubbles there. So let's start here. So I'll grab this funny little flowery pattern. What we're going to do is take this pattern layer, and we're just going to switch it to luminosity at first. We can also try out multiply, and that will do some things as well. Not really what I want to do. Luminosity's kind of working. Darken definitely isn't going to do what I want. Color burns way too obvious. It'll be either multiply or luminosity, or it may end up being kind of a mix of both, meaning that we could take a layer, duplicate it, and then take the upper one and make it luminosity, but then pull back its opacity a little bit. Yeah, I just don't know. Oh, it looks like I lost my selection down here too. Well, that's a pity. I must not have been holding the Shift key when I did that selection earlier, so shame on me. Let me step back through my undos for just a moment. And we'll get all the way down to before we did the feather, and I'll just hold down Shift and make another circular selection down here. We'll feather that again. Mea culpa and stuff. So modify. Let's do a feather. 10 pixels is fine. Let me try a different pattern, though. That one just wasn't speaking to me. Let me see what else they got. Rock patterns are generally odd enough looking that they could probably work just fine. This could work. What if we just take this and we set it to multiply, so it is darkening. We turn off our UVs because they're just kind of getting in the way. That could work. I just want to test that. So let's do our quick save. Make sure we have focus over here. Save, kablam, replace. And jump back over to Blender and reload. And we have something a little more interesting going on there. I do want to kind of break this up, though. This little band around the base of the banana. It's cool, it's just not as cool as it could be. So let's go back over to Photoshop. And I'll turn on my UVs to kind of help me out. And what I'm going to do is grab my smudge tool. And let's make sure we're on this brown layer. And just see how this is pulling on its own. That's not too bad. So let me bring the brush size down a little bit. So we're just going to smear out some irregularities. Notice that I'm kind of fanning out along the direction of the body. I'm also not doing this right on that seam. Also, we can take the corners of the banana and we can make really big, obvious ones down the corners. Just keep stroking over that over and over so that the color just kind of smears out. I'll make my brush size even smaller, and we'll break it up even more. Okay, now let's do the same up here. Start off with my brush size a little bigger. Now the corners aren't going to be as big of a deal here because we're up on that stem. But do make sure that the smears you make are not all that regular. You don't want to seem like the same thing is being repeated all over the surface. So I have a little bit of fun with it. I'll make my brush size small again and pull out some thinner ones. Let's turn off the UVs. And I'm going to take that pattern layer, I'm going to duplicate it to make it a little darker. And let's give this a quick test. Save, replace, jump over to Blender and reload. And that's definitely having much more of an impact. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. Let's do a little bit of greening of the banana's body, because that'll always make things look a little bit more like a real banana. They're almost never perfectly yellow, are they? So let's go ahead and add some kind of green layer. Now, keep in mind, we have been using a heck of a lot of solid color layers. I love these because if at some point you decide that that brown is too light or too dark, of course it's the easiest thing in the world to tweak that. I just like to continuously point that out while I work, because often I will get in, take a look at something, and later on down the road be like, I wish I'd made that a little bit darker. And it's real easy to do if you work in this manner. Okay, I guess we can go ahead and add this in the ends area, because I'm going to basically just do my greening at the end. So let's go ahead and create a solid color layer. And I'll just start with some random shade of Put Your Eyes Out green. We'll invert this. Now let's grab our brush, and I'll make it nice and big. I generally don't trust myself with the airbrush settings. I find myself to be a little too heavy-handed. I guess I just need to practice, but we can turn down the opacity, and then I'm just going to do several strokes. Let me go ahead and turn the UVs on so I can track the flow of the topology a little bit. Now, what I've done will cause a seam that I will probably have to go in and adjust, but that's okay. So I'll just kind of fill in this band of color here as best I can, knowing that we probably will end up with a seam that I'll have to tweak. In fact, let me go ahead and test that and see how bad it looks. There will be a seam, just so everybody knows. So when we get over there, you're like, hey, I knew that was going to happen. So over in Blender, just reload. Yeah, but it's not that bad, strangely enough. The color doesn't feel right, but the sea image taking place back there is not the worst I've ever seen. Huh, interesting how that works out. You anticipate something being really horrible, and then when you get there, it's not that bad. Now, that color, as I mentioned, can be adjusted, and we have to kind of watch out for that, because you don't want it to look like, nasty, but I don't really want it to be like a put-your-eyes-out green either. Let's try something around here. Turn our UVs back on, make sure we're brushing once more, and that we have the layer selected. And let's just try some down here as well. So put a few strokes that way and a few strokes that way. So that'll be right there at our seam. We'll just kind of see how that goes. And I'm just making several layered kind of fanning strokes. We are going to need to move this underneath that browning layer. So we'll just slide that down. So that pops up underneath. And we'll let it get nice and dense down at the very bottom. You can hear my pen just ticking away madly. And let's do a little bit of blur. To do this, though, I'm going to take a look at the actual layer itself, alt-clicking on it. Let's do a Gaussian blur, kind of break those strokes up a bit. And we'll turn off our UVs and do a quick save test. And reload. And our banana has some greenness going on. Again, we got a little bit of a seam taking place there. We can just kind of brush over that a few more times on either side, and I think that'll be just fine. But we clearly have something much more banana-like going on with the body. I do think, however, this is a good place to go ahead and wrap the video up. So that is going to wrap things up for this episode. And I want to thank everybody who has been joining in and watching these videos. Of course, a big thanks goes out to our member sponsors. And I'll catch you all on the next video.